Okay, we're starting the recording.
Recording in progress.
Didn't have to say that. Good evening, everyone. Let's see, I believe we do have a quorum, so let's begin the meeting. This is the Zoning and Planning Committee meeting of the Newton City Council on Monday, March 27th, starting a little earlier than usual at 6:30 p.m. And I'm Deb Crossley, Chair of the committee, Councilor at Large from Ward 5, and joining us online are Councilor Vicky Danberg, who's in France, so it's very late there, and at large from Ward 6 and Vice Chair of the committee, Councilor Josh Princeton, at large from Ward 4. And then I'm going to come back into the room. We have Councilor Holly Ryan, Ward Councilor from Ward 8, Councilor Pam Wright, at large from Ward 3, and Councilor Allison Leary, at large from Ward 1. I see as well that we are joined by a number of other city councilors who are not on the committee, who are joining us online. Oh, it's hard for me to see everybody's name, but I see Councilor Lucas, Councilor, saw somebody else. Where did they go?
You look on the right.
I am looking on the right.
Oh.
Humphrey and Maliki are here.
Councilor Maliki. Okay. All right. Well, that's who I see at the beginning of the meeting.
Councilor Humphreys.
Oh, and thank you, Councilor Humphrey as well. Okay. Other folks who join us later will be welcome, but might not get to recognize you the early part of the meeting. So we are also joined as usual by planning staff, Director Barney Heath and Zachary Lamel. And we are joined tonight by the law department in the person of Andrew Lee for the first couple of items. And for the first couple of items, we are joined by members of the sustainability team, Leora Silks, our energy coach, and Ann Berwick, the co-director of sustainability. So the agenda tonight begins with a couple of items that are climate action items, things that help to serve our purpose in our climate action plan. And then we will be continuing our discussions on village center zoning, but focusing on a proposal to allow a density bonus for increased affordable units. So
Is Util here?
Util is not here this evening.
So they did the calculations that are in there?
Well, could we get to this item when we, yeah. So I'm going to introduce the first item, which is a request for an ordinance to regulate embodied carbon in new construction. It's item 227-22. And it's been a very long time, a year or so, since the committee was introduced to the concept of embodied carbon by Ms. Silks and a working group of experts from within our community who have been advising her on this subject. And it has taken this much time to come up with the draft ordinance that you see in your packet, which is intended to go into the section in 5.13 that is reserved for this purpose. It is, I'm going to hand this over to Leora in a moment to present the basic elements of it. But it is to basically require reporting on embodied carbon for petitions that are seeking special permits from the city council. And she will, as she needs to, or if council has questions that are of a highly technical nature, the members of the advisory working group that she assembled are with us this evening as well, and I'll let her introduce them. I believe we are also joined before we get started though by our members of our planning board. I do see Mr. Doringer. I'm not sure Kelly Brown is with us yet this evening. Okay, maybe I see Peter Doringer. I'm not sure I see anybody else. But for these first items, we will not be voting on these items. The first two items, we will be deciding to go forward or not, as always, but also, and comments and questions and discussion, but we're hoping to set a public hearing, or at least consider opportunities for public hearings in the next highly scheduled several months. So before we begin, though, we have been joined by City Council President and at-large Councilor from Ward 2, Susan Albright. You're just in time. You missed all the preamble. So, Ms. Silks, could you present the essence of the proposed embodied carbon ordinance?
Yes, can you hear me and can you see my screen?
Yes, but we're asking Jacqueline to turn down the volume.
Okay, I don't want to be shouting at anyone. That's not the intention at all. Please let me know if there are any issues with audio or visual throughout. So as Councillor Crossley introduced, a brief overview of embodied carbon and what a proposed ordinance language could look like. This is specifically, when we get there, just starting from the beginning, we are talking specifically about buildings already subject to the sustainable development requirements of our zoning ordinance. So this is only for large projects over 20,000 square feet that are already going through other sustainability requirements. So I'll start with a brief background because it has been a year since as this group we last talked about embodied carbon, and then get into the language. In short, embodied carbon is the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the entire life cycle of any item. In our case, we're talking about buildings. So we're thinking about all of the emissions associated with extraction, manufacturing, construction through its life cycle, through eventual repair, recycling, whatever it may look like toward the end. In contrast to the operational carbon, for a building, we're talking about electricity, fuel, heating, whatever that may be. This is all of the materials that go into the building, really thinking about the concrete and the steel as the building materials that have the largest impact and most embodied carbon associated with them is really what we're talking about. Embodied carbon is significant and urgent, especially as we are addressing the operational carbon piece in all sorts of other conversations that have gone through this committee and others. We now have very efficient buildings using very little carbon in their operations, which makes embodied carbon a much larger segment of the building, the total carbon impact of the building. And it's important for us to be thinking about this especially as we try to meet upcoming climate goals. The embodied carbon piece really has a larger impact toward the beginning of its life from that extraction and manufacturing. So even if our buildings are very efficient in their operation, it has taken us a lot of effort to put them there in the first place. I don't have the number directly off the top of my head, but it can often be over 50% of the emissions in total for a building in the first 10 years come from its initial building stage. So that's why we want to be thinking about this now. There are quite a number of tools available for building professionals, architects, structural engineers, green consultants, and others to do embodied carbon analysis. Many of these talk with other sorts of programs that these same building professionals are already using. Many of these are available for free to be used. So just there is quite the world out there for people to be using. And there are a lot of different strategies for what addressing embodied carbon in a building can look like. This can be about the design of the building, about how much of a building is reused, about the spacing of structural elements in especially the foundation of the building, about the materials that end up being used. And then within those materials, if we think about not just the design, but the procurement of what exactly is the cement mix in the cement that, or in the concrete that will be used, what other sorts of materials are going into the building. So there's quite the world out there that is very much growing as people are exploring a variety of ways to reduce embodied carbon. But as I said, for ordinance purposes, we're just talking about analyzing and bringing this conversation to the building practitioners of thinking about all of these different possible things that can be done. Just to take note of what's going on locally around us, the town of Brookline over a year ago has instituted a requirement that town projects must use low carbon concrete. This is in buildings as well as things like sidewalks. City of Cambridge and Boston are also considering similar things to what I will present in just a moment about addressing embodied carbon, first thinking just about analysis, and both of them are looking beyond analysis as well to within larger projects within their zoning ordinance. And we are in discussions with them and are updating each other on what progress has looked like in each of our cities. There are also a variety of bills at the state level addressing embodied carbon in a few other ways that are starting to gain some traction there. So in Newton, what have we done? First, just a reminder that back in 2019, we had these initial discussions of embodied carbon, and they decided that that was not the time to go further. So embodied carbon is mentioned as something that should be addressed eventually, but is not directly listed associated with any actions in our climate action plan. And in our sustainable development design, which is now what we're talking about today, section 5.13 from 2019 establishes a section for addressing embodied carbon, but at the time was left simply reserved. And so what we're talking about today is what does it look like to fill in that section, specifically within 5.13, buildings over 20,000 square feet subject to sustainable design requirements. So a few years later, fall of 2021, we had this working group come about with Mark Webster, Russell Feldman, and Beverly Craig. Mark Webster is here today. Russell and Beverly unfortunately could not make it, but we've been talking about what could possibly happen to get us to the point that we are right here, right now, with actual language to share. So about a year ago, we gave this presentation, got much more in depth about 101 to embodied carbon, gave similar presentations and started to talk about possible ordinance language with a variety of other stakeholders, that is the EDC, the Chamber Real Estate Group, Planning Board, throughout the following months, wrote language, and now here we are. So what is the language itself? The full draft and its edits are in the packet, the Friday packet, but I'm just gonna walk through really the core piece of it on the screen now, and then for questions can discuss any and all questions. But the core piece, right, we're just talking about analysis of these large buildings. So we say a green building project must provide analysis that estimates the embodied carbon of the project, and we're splitting it into two different sizes. So for buildings 20,000 square feet to 50,000 square feet, we suggest a limited analysis of the structural materials using life cycle analysis tools or environmental product declarations. So life cycle analysis tools such as the ones on the previous screen that I had shared. Environmental product declarations are statements about the product that are more frequently available with a lot of materials such as cement mixtures. For projects over 50,000 square feet, our suggestion is to ask for a slightly larger level of analysis. So this would be a whole building life cycle assessment of both structural and enclosure materials, and a statement about how that compares to other projects and why they're choosing those materials. So this is a description that is very similar and pulls from a variety of different programs that exist that ask for essentially this exact requirement, those being within other green building rating systems, such as LEED, Green Globes, and the International Living Future Institute. So to meet this requirement, we would suggest that these projects go to these existing standards and use the language from those standards to figure out exactly how they are doing their analysis. This is very similar to section 5.13.4a, right above this paragraph in the ordinance, where we're saying you should meet a green certification that can be LEED, Passive House, Enterprise. So really pulling the similar language from above, and going. But in this case, we would just be looking at within LEED, Green Globes, International Living Future Institute, just their section on embodied carbon, and within that, just how they suggest to analyze the embodied carbon, not a reduction requirement. And finally, if a building is using at least 50% of, if at least 50% of the floor area of a new project would be reusing a pre-existing structure, we are suggesting that they would not have to go through the process of a further analysis, because we know that they're already going to have fairly low embodied carbon as they are reusing another structure. So this is the core piece of what we are asking for, is an analysis at two different levels, depending on the size of the building. And what does this actually look like in practice? Is that at the special permit stage, we would ask for, as part of their sustainability narrative that they're already submitting with other sorts of information about the project, we would ask for a statement, an acknowledgement that they're going to be addressing embodied carbon and specifying what method they would be using once they move forward. And then after the special permit has been granted, the project is approved, they know that they're going to get to move forward, they would do the actual analysis itself, and as part of the building permit submission, submit the full analysis. The analysis would be done and signed off by a registered design professional. That could be structural engineer, architect, green consultant, or others on the project team, and then submitted. And what the city is doing is just checking off that they have done this work. If they are looking to talk with others, great, but from a meeting requirements perspective, we are checking off that they've done this analysis, because that's all that we are requiring. So that's the basis of what we are proposing. And now you have the full draft of the language with you right now. You also, in the Friday packet, have FAQs. So we went through a lot of questions about what is a whole building life cycle assessment? How much does this cost? Who is trained to do these sort of things? So a lot of those questions are answered there. We can talk about those. If you have further questions, please ask. And then, as Councillor Crossett said, depending on how this conversation goes, if this were to move forward, the next step would be about scheduling a public hearing. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ms. Silks. I wonder if before I take questions, there's one question that people tend to ask once we get into this. It's sort of, why are we only requiring an analysis of the embodied carbon in a building versus requiring a reduction of embodied carbon from some set point? And I would like to put Councillor Lee, Councillor Lee, on the spot for a moment. Could you? I could try to explain this, but I think from a legal point of view, why is it that we are where we are with this?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The reason is actually fairly straightforward. Leora and her team actually did a very good job being very thoughtful about how they were going to approach embodied carbon. We did discuss an option of reducing embodied carbon, which would have a requirement where that would affect the building and structural materials, specifically the concrete itself, which the building code actually regulates very explicitly. So to put it simply,
I don't know what that was. Someone might have to mute. Please go ahead.
So to put it simply, because the building code already regulates these kinds of, the kinds of mixtures or concrete and the structural materials themselves, and it's very clear that that can't be regulated through zoning. The advice at this point is that the city's likely preempted from enacting anything that actually reduces embodied carbon in a way that affects the types of building materials that are accessible to a developer. So this was kind of I'll say a step one in the process to better understand embodied carbon, how it works. And I did look very closely to make sure that this is within the realm of the city's authority, and it appears that the answer is yes. So that's kind of a summary of the analysis that was done to get to this point.
Thank you very much for that. And I know a lot of times what's on the council's mind is, well, how does this play out during the special permit process? So if folks are on land use, if there's folks here from land use, on which many of us have served at one time or another, requiring more than an analysis is something that could conceivably be negotiated as part of a project, as long as it's a choice. It could be one of the things that the petitioner decides to package as compliance with our criterion 5, reducing energy and natural resources. Correct?
I think that's true as long as during the special permit process, that's something that the developer is amenable to. I mean, that's part of, I'll let Leora speak more to it, but that's part of the thinking with regards to this analysis, which it does have the information, but it also has the developer, gives them an opportunity to think about ways they can reduce embodied carbon in a cost-effective manner as they're doing their project. So it certainly can be something that arises in a special permit process where the developer voluntarily makes some decision that factors as an amenity in exchange for a bonus in density or whatever it might be that they actually are requesting the special permit for.
Thank you very much. So I want to thank Leora for a very clear presentation, and thank you for that information. I have a question from President Albright first, and then Councilor Wright.
Yes, thank you for the presentation, Ms. Silks. So I have a question for you. Do we have any indication that just forcing or asking people to do the analysis, I guess, causes them to think more about embodied carbon and therefore might reduce the embodied carbon? Is there any indication that that's something that might happen?
I don't have a specific project off the top of my head, but I know this is now starting. This is something that we are seeing developers do themselves already. And also city projects. A number of our recent city buildings have started to do an analysis and look at these materials. And I don't, out of my back pocket can say, aha, this one did the analysis and found XYZ. But there are a lot of things, right? As we're talking about, there are a variety of different ways that you can address embodied carbon, both in the design and the materials themselves. And so the idea is that by bringing this up into a conversation, by making sure that is part of the conversation early on, all the way at the special permit phase, there would be time. And really it's about education of saying, I do know that a lot of the lower embodied carbon materials, such as the concrete, right, finding the mixtures that are lower embodied carbon are often cost comparable to the quote unquote standards. And so part of it is just the education, and then the design or the project team has the ability to choose what hopefully is good for both their wallet and also our planet.
Can I ask one more question?
Can I follow up on that? So, because I believe that Leora might call on Mr. Webster, who is a structural engineer, and this is part of his work. And I believe he's aware that the Northland project actually did agree to do an embodied carbon analysis, did do it and shared their results with the Building Standards Committee. So I wonder if perhaps Mr. Webster could share some more light on this.
Yeah, I think, thank you. I think Leora covered it quite well. We are certainly seeing many project teams evaluating embodied carbon already. And we do think that many of those teams, if required to measure, will start thinking about it. And there's a good chance that that could lead to reductions.
So could I ask both of you as well, if, you know, you mentioned, all the various standards organizations, while we're not asking them to reduce embodied carbon, just to study it, do they get points? If they do reduce embodied carbon, do the various standards organization give them points towards whatever level of sustainability they're trying for?
Yes, so the LEED credit, for example, which is likely what will most often be used, especially because that is also one of the options that we have in our green certification requirement. I believe you get a single point for doing analysis, you get 2 or 3 for following through, depending on the amount of reduction you provide. So it is laid out, and especially for LEED, where they might be more incentivized to be getting that credit or getting that certification, that is there. The other certifications that we have listed, the Green Globes and the International Living Future, similarly, those are more robust systems for anyone who would like to dive into those, but those aren't reflected in the same way that LEED is for our specific ordinance.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Councilor Wright and then Leary.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the presentation. I have a question. So we're discussing about village centers and by right, and so the maximum is like 72,000 square foot building, and then 85,000, we're going to discuss tonight another story. Is this only by special permit? So anything built by right would not have to follow this?
That's correct.
Okay. Is there any way to make it?
No, as you heard from Andrew Lee at this point, what we understand at the moment is some of these materials are very explicitly controlled in the building code. So it's also a very new industry. I'll let Mr. Lamel speak to this.
And I'll let, maybe Andrew Lee might jump in as well, but I think if 5.13 is written in a way that says development over 20,000 square feet triggers these requirements, then development over 20,000 square feet, not the special permit, would trigger it. But and if it does say by special permit, then the way we would get around, we'd have to think about changing that.
That's interesting because this is a section that is otherwise entirely devoted to special permits. So I'm not sure if something else in this that covers that, but Mr. Lee, can you address that?
So actually the sustainable zoning ordinance itself, where this embodied carbon is proposed to live, that section only applies to special permit projects that are greater than 20,000 square feet. And one thing that I will bring up is back in 2019, when this sustainable ordinance was actually adopted, it was intentionally only to be applied to special permit projects because of the uncertainty and inability of the city to have those same requirements for by right projects. That's the way that it was structured, and we're not aware of any recent developments in the law that would change the approach this day.
So this would only pertain to a small
This
amount.
reporting requirement that we're considering.
Yeah, so only for lots over 30,000, and if we make it bigger, over 40,000 square feet. Right now,
Let's not confuse the two things, but I think the thing to say is yes, it only applies to petitions, projects seeking special permits
Okay.
right now.
Madam Chair, can I say one more thing about that, which is with regards to the embodied carbon analysis, sitting here today, I'm not able to say for certain that we wouldn't be able to make that requirement for by right projects. The law department hasn't done that analysis. We've only looked at it in the limited scope of adding it to our currently existing sustainable zoning ordinance. So I'm not trying to foreclose anything or at the same time saying that it's not a problem. I'm simply noting that that analysis hasn't been completed.
Thank you for that, because actually it's not clear to me why we couldn't require reporting. That's not really in conflict with the code, but I hear you. Director Heath, you're all set? Okay. Council Wright?
Yeah, so in this markup we had, and it was on the third page, and it was 5.13.4.3.3. It says projects which at least 50% of the floor area comprises reuse of a pre-existing structure are not subject to these provisions. So I wonder if you add 4 stories on top of that footprint, so it isn't required then?
Could, I don't know, Ms. Silks, can you further explain that section? Or call on Mr. Webster to do so?
The goal of this piece about not requiring an analysis for projects that are reusing 50 or that whose new floor area will be reused for 50% of the building is saying, if you're using a structure that is already there, we know that the embodied carbon will be lower because your material is already there. You're not extracting new materials, not building things. So this is intended as a benefit, making it slightly easier for projects that are reusing materials. So for a project that is, if it's building on top of a new project or of an existing building, I guess I would say whatever the definition of the building would be, whatever the total floor area of the project that is being presented in that permitting project would be helping define whatever requirements that project would need to meet.
In other words, try to make it simpler. If you have a 2,000 square foot, 1-story building and or 2,000 square foot, 2-story building, and you add a story, you're adding 2,000 square feet, but that's not 50% of the total project.
So it's a total floor area, not just the floor area on the first floor that you're counting.
Is, that's how I'm reading it, but I'm thinking we need to just take a close look at that definition.
Yeah, because I just think of the footprint, kind of the floor area, but it didn't say footprint, so it's
No, it
probably the
didn't say
volume.
footprint.
It's the volume of the building, so as
Yeah.
long as it's at least 50%, so you're adding 49%, then you wouldn't have to
Correct.
go there. Okay. Okay, I just needed some clarifications. Thank you.
All set? All right. Counselor-
Wait, so
sorry.
can the law
Never
department,
mind.
the first one, the law department take a look to see if we can do this by right?
Sure, we'd probably want to take that up separately because I'm guessing we would, if we wanted to require buildings over a certain square footage to conduct an embodied carbon analysis. That's not unlike something we've talked about in earlier years. And I won't go there. So I think it would go in a different section because this section, sustainability guidelines, is intended for special permits. So I think that's not part of this docket item. But there's no reason we can't take a look at that. Right, Andrew?
Yes, we can look at that.
Yes? Yeah, okay, good, thank you. I think it requires a separate docket item. We might want to learn a few things from putting this forward. Might be helpful before we put it out there as a requirement, that the analysis would be a requirement for by right construction. And by the way, there's really no by right construction for buildings over 20,000 square feet, except possibly in the village center zoning district, right? Okay. All set?
Yes,
Thank you. Councilor Leary.
Okay, so that actually the discussion just brought up another comment that I think Leora might be able to answer. It's just, so essentially this incentivizes reuse. Would you say that, Leora?
I don't know how large of incentive it would end up being. The work that needs to go into an embodied carbon analysis, because we're not requiring actual reduction. So the analysis itself is, some hours of the project team's time. These are projects that are already working with a green consultant, certainly already have architects, structural engineers on staff. So it is, depending on the level of analysis, between 5,000 and 25,000, I think was the number we gave here. Although recent discussions, I think that's likely to be really maxed out at maybe 10 to 15,000. So, I mean, that is a number, but in terms of the project costs of any of these projects, demolition or complete new construct or renovation or new construction, that's under 0.5% of the project costs. And so I don't think this would necessarily encourage or really, point people toward reuse. It is about thinking about the materials, whether they be new or whether they be existing, and whatever decisions might be made about that project, that there are ways to make those have lower emissions in either case.
Okay, so right now we're just requiring an analysis of embodied carbon, but the next logical step would be reduction, right?
Yeah, we, that with legal thoughts, and in getting some data on how this is going and what these analyses look like, and seeing as the field moves in different directions, that is a potential future.
Okay, and I was wondering about if it was going on in Newton now, and I just heard Northland is doing it. Are there other developers that are also starting to move ahead with exploring embodied carbon in their projects?
Mr. Webster might have further thoughts on those. I know a variety of the city projects have, as I had mentioned. I am trying to think of other developers I've talked to about this.
I believe Mark Development is
yeah.
Also was pressed to do.
Yes, they certainly are.
And I mean, there's lots of questions here, but I'm gonna just ask one more. So the goal will be to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and as you said, as buildings get more and more efficient, the embodied carbon in the materials and such will be a larger chunk of our greenhouse gas emissions. Do we have any idea of how much greenhouse gas emissions will be reduced by this plan? Can we measure it?
So with just requiring analysis, it's hard to, what we will get from each project, right, in the language that we're asking them for is a comparison of their building to an average building. So as we get more of these analyses coming in, if they are showing that is lower than the quote average building, that'll be some numbers that we can use to come up with an estimate of the impact that this is having. Yeah, without a reduction requirement, right? We can't say, yes, this is reduced X amount, but it would be on a per project basis.
Okay, so we'll really learn quite a bit from this, right?
That's the goal.
Experiment. Okay, that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilor Leary. I don't see any hands up, but I got a piece of information today from some members of the Building Standards Committee and Mr. Webster and Ms. Silks. The working group is not stopping here. Just so folks know, they're not, their original idea, I believe, was to come up with some metrics that Mr. Webster says, are being met in the industry. And they are sharing them with our city first through the Design Review Committee, who I just learned today are going to, we passed, we didn't really pass it. We took it up in public facilities 6 years ago, a set of guidelines for city buildings, municipal buildings that are going to be looked at for updating, because it was 6 years ago and then we had COVID and so on. Anyway, our standards of construction in the city have become increasingly higher. And as Josh Morse has informed us, they are doing embodied carbon analysis for, and will be reducing to the extent that's possible for New Cal and a next school, I can't remember, well, Countryside in Franklin, that they'll be doing this sort of thing routinely. So Mr. Webster and Ms. Craig and Mr. Feldman all have contributed their stores of knowledge to this effort to help advise what some of those metrics can be. And I can't speak to it any more than that at the risk of saying something that's incorrect, but I think it's worth our understanding that Ms. Silks has assembled this group who have been really invaluable in advising on specifics on an industry that's really quite new.
It's amazing. Yeah, it's great work.
So, is there anything else you folks would like to add that it's critical for us to know before we take up a conversation about whether we want to continue forward and consider this ordinance as drafted and hold a public hearing?
I'll just add, as you were just saying, right there, this is a new and growing field, and we have a lot more, whether or not things end up in ordinance, information about, as you're saying, what concrete standards or what concrete emissions could look like, or suggestions on ways to address reductions from the Building Standards Committee, from Josh Morse himself, has some thoughts on addressing this in city buildings as well. And so our goal is to also put together a guide, just ideas, references, tools for anyone who would like to be looking at it to be helpful. And I could see this, right, seeing as this is part of 5.13, also including other references for other sustainability pieces, just as a freestanding document and resource of information for people, whether or not it is a requirement to understand these building concepts and how they might apply to a variety of projects that folks may be taking on.
Great, thank you very much. So, members of the committee, are you interested in holding a public hearing on this subject with this ordinance as drafted? I'm seeing heads nodding. If there's anyone from online who has anything more to say, please raise your hand. I see Mr. Chrisman.
And that means you're calling on me as well, right?
That means I'm calling on you. I
Okay.
see. Oh, yeah.
Just sometimes people get excited and point out that they can see me, and that's an exciting thing in and of itself. It seems to me this is fairly low stakes, while at the same time sort of being as much as we can do. So I'm definitely comfortable moving to a public hearing. It feels like if there are advancements in the field, it could be not in terms of what the ordinance is, but what the studies will show and what potential remediation capabilities there are. So having said all that, I'm perfectly comfortable moving forward.
Thank you. And I'm not seeing any objections, so I'm not sure we can choose a date tonight. I printed out the city budget calendar, which begins May 1st. And we have meetings every night, for much of that month. So we could, we have a couple choices. And so I'm glad planning staff is here too, because we have a lot on our plate with respect to village center zoning and MBTA communities, et cetera. The second meeting in April is the first time we could possibly hold a public hearing on this. We could put it at the beginning of that meeting, or we can wait till early June. My feeling is that this will not draw a lot of fire, that it would be a relatively concise public hearing. We would need a presentation, so a member of the public will understand what it is we're doing. And my thought is we could do it the end of April, but I want to hear what you all think.
I think we could. I think the hope is for that April meeting to also be, diving into the next iteration for village center zoning. So that'll be a hefty meeting. So I just want to put that out there, but it seems like this could move forward in a
Like the first
timely manner.
half hour, 45 minutes, we could take care of this.
I think so.
Okay,
Maybe
You
we
only
can
have
start
half
early.
meetings.
Yeah.
we could start early, yeah.
Think so.
Okay, great. It would be, that's better than having another separate meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So let's, someone, I think, Counselor Crispin, you still have your hand up, so I think you would like to propose that we, set a
Well,
public.
I wanted to make one point first, which is, I don't think we have foreclosed the possibility. I don't know how in depth we've discussed it, but as we evaluate the Village Center project,
Mhm.
one of the things that comes up is the threshold for special permits. And I just want to make sure that we harmonize the threshold after we finish with the zoning along with the threshold in this ordinance. So if we want to wait until the point in our village planning discussions when we've determined what the special permit threshold is going to be, that might make sense. If we're not going to touch that threshold, then we can harmonize today. Does that make sense?
I think I understand where you're going with this, but I'm not sure that, yeah, hold a sec, not sure, I'm not sure that, when we set this public hearing should factor into that.
Well, I'm just thinking that we want the proposal to reflect the special permit threshold for the size of construction projects. And that is part of this ordinance. I mean, the special permit threshold is not part of this ordinance, but this ordinance is set intentionally to align with where the threshold is for special permits,
And,
I think.
well, can you help me out with this?
Well,
I'm not-
I think the question is, you want to get information from the law department on whether or not we can require the embodied carbon analysis without a special permit or not. That's what we were talking about before. The problem,
Understood.
the problem with putting it into 5.13 is it's written explicitly. It's triggered with this, it's tied to the special permit. And so I think we need to get that information from the law department, and then we can go from there. And you're worried about that not happening in time.
Well, we might get the analysis from the law department and Andrew can speak to that, but I think we need a separate docket item in order to apply this to by right projects. And if we change the special permit threshold in village center zoning, this would change. It wouldn't make any difference because.
It would not.
Madam Chair, can I jump in?
Yes, please.
So in 5.13.3A, sets the application of the entire 5.13 section to building the construction or substantial reconstruction of one or more buildings totaling 20,000 square feet or more of gross floor area that also requires issuance of a special permit under any provision of this zoning ordinance. As of right now, that 20,000 square feet is the requiring issuance of the special permit. That is a line that is not changing in this new proposed language that adds in embodied carbon. So I think there might be a few different pieces going on. One is the question of adding in the embodied carbon analysis piece as presented tonight. One is, do any of these pieces apply, whether maybe it's embodied carbon, maybe it's the other sections of sustainability about EV chargers or about green standards that may apply outside of a special permit project, especially if that special permit square footage requirement were to be changed. And my 2 cents would be that that conversation could happen separately from the addition to this section. And then I guess the third piece is, would that line at some point also change to be a different square footage directly in 5.13?
All that is true, but I think what you might not have as much information about is that we have this thing called village center zoning that we're working on. It's a rather large project. And it's an overlay district and it has its own set of definitions for what triggers a special permit within that overlay district, completely separate from our 20,000 square feet and those triggers.
Right.
So I think what I heard Zach's, Mr. Lamel say is that those. Whatever we do in here, because this is written for special permit applications. Will then only apply to what in the village center zoning triggers a special permit, however we define that. And it's not defined by 20,000 square feet. But it would, anything in this section will apply to criterion 5. This section is to inform criterion 5 in the special permit process. And the other question is separate, I think it's separate. If we want to take this reporting requirement and see if we can apply it to by right projects, that's a whole separate issue, and I think we need to have a separate docket item. Does that make sense?
So the one confusion, the section that Ms. Solz just read about 20,000 to 50,000.
Yeah.
So 20,000 in the village center zoning would no longer require a special permit.
No, so what in the village center zoning is under 30,000 square foot lot. Now, the biggest building that you can do in VC3, because we have a footprint, is 72 or 74,000 square feet. Now, tonight, we're going to talk about adding an extra floor and increasing the footprint for affordable. So now you're looking at a building that's 85,000 square feet. So, and it doesn't need a special permit. So then it wouldn't need to meet that.
It would not have to do that.
Right.
And you could have multiple buildings. And you wouldn't have two quite that size on one lot, being under 30,000 square feet. And we're also looking at raising the special permit. It might not be 30,000 square foot lot, it might be 40,000. So I think there's a lot, these big buildings, I think a lot of them are towards the village center, so we wouldn't be capturing what we're trying to do on most of our buildings.
So it's two, but it is two separate issues.
It is
We could
two separate
probably-
issues.
If we could do this now to apply to special permits now and then worry about this as we go along.
I think so.
Yeah.
It seems like this is a living document.
Yeah.
It'll change.
Yeah.
As we grow and as we learn.
True,
more about it.
and what Councilor Wright is saying is, I mean, let's make sure we understand what the special permit threshold is and isn't,
Sure.
and if there are aspects of our zoning that we can make by right, because we're expanding what can be done by right, then we can take that up as part of village center zoning, or we can take it up as a separate ordinance, which is probably better.
Right, and just one last thing here, I think we're dealing with a change to our existing zoning, period. The village center zoning is not passed and shouldn't be up for discussion at this point in time.
Correct.
We're dealing with our special permit process now, which is at 20,000 square feet, and that's where this language would be triggered. So I think when we're thinking about what to do and set a public hearing, that's what the conversation should
Yeah.
be focused on, period.
That's correct, and we don't want to confuse people at the public hearing. So I agree that we should limit it to this, but good point, Councilor Wright. Let's take up, all of the kinds of things that we want to consider that, if they were exclusive to special permits before, we have a new set of metrics, et cetera, what else can apply. Okay, so, Councilor Criswell, I think you were going to make a motion to set a public hearing and for the second meeting in April.
Madam Chair, I'd like to move that we set a public hearing for our second meeting in April.
Thank you so much. So all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Any abstentions? Excellent.
You didn't need a motion.
And we need a motion
I'll
to,
make the motion.
and Councilor Leary made the motion to hold. All those in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Abstentions? Thank you so much. Ms. Silks and Mr. Webster, you're welcome to stay with us. We're going to have a very interesting presentation next by Co-Director of Sustainability Ann Berwick. After that, I'm guessing you'll want to go home if you don't already. I want to thank you so much for all of the huge amount of work that you put into this over the past year, the many hours, and with the law department as well. And we're going to move on. Thank you. Just lost my agenda. There we go. The next item For the next item, I'm introducing our co-director of sustainability, Ann Berwick. Yes?
I think we were planning on having the affordability piece come now.
Yeah.
Co-director Berwick has graciously allowed us to do that while our consultant is here, and she'll come on later.
She did?
Yes.
Oh, my goodness, it's gonna be a long night. Ms. Berwick, have you? Here.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Are you sure?
that was the plan all along.
Oh, okay. That was the plan all along. That's not what she and I talked about today. Can I just check in with you, please? Just, can I hear it in your own? No, it's not that I don't trust you. It's just that Ms. Berwick and I spoke just this afternoon. Are you okay with that? Does that work for you?
Well, yes, if that's what we need to do, what I had said was that I'm happy to be flexible. I'm just wondering if that's going to be a long presentation. I suspect my presentation is going to be quite short, but it's up to other people in terms of what their needs are.
You know, quite a short presentation. Thank you for that, because this is really, we're going to hear from Director Berwick, really a summary of her memo to us. And folks will have some questions, but all we have to decide is whether we want to go forward or not, based on the particulars, right, classes. Okay, so item 94-23 is a discussion and possible ordinance requiring electrification of all new construction and substantial renovations. And what's at issue here is the Newton, being able to participate in the 10 communities program, which the state has now defined by issuing a model ordinance that we will have to adopt, and which is a little bit different from our home rule petition, as there were many home rule petitions. They were all a little bit different from one another. So Ms. Berwick, can you explain to us where we are?
Yes, before I do that, I just want to make sure I'm not messing up anybody else's schedule. So Barney, is there somebody who needs to leave? Is this going to be really problematic for someone?
I think we're fine, Ann.
Okay, great. Okay. I'll be brief anyway. A lot of you have heard a lot of this before. So as Chair Crossley said, Newton and a number of other communities submitted home rule petitions to the legislature looking for home rule authority to require all new construction and substantial renovations to be all electric. Rather than acting on those home rule petitions, the legislature acted on none of the home rule petitions. Instead, in a recent climate bill, it said the first 10 communities to submit home rule petitions can participate in the 10 communities program and require electrification of new construction and substantial renovations. Interestingly, by the way, West Tisbury was one of the 10, dropped out, and Boston took its place. And I just am loving the idea that Boston substituted for West Tisbury. But to keep going, so as Chair Crossley said, our electrification ordinance has to look very much like, not be identical to, but look very much like DOER's model rule. Our home rule petition was different from DOER's model rule in a few respects. One is it excluded large commercial buildings, our thinking at that time being, well, we'll cover those with BERDO. So it excluded large commercial buildings. It lists a number of exemptions, for example, outdoor heating and cooking not connected to a building's infrastructure, emergency backup generation. And it did not exclude labs and medical facilities other than Newton Wellesley Hospital. So now let me go through those three. It excluded large commercial buildings. There's no question DOER will not permit that. So to be one of the 10 communities, our ordinance, Newton's ordinance, cannot exclude large commercial buildings. And the draft you've seen that was in your packet does not contain that exclusion, because I'm confident, having had discussions with DOER, that will not be permissible in order to be one of the 10 communities. Exemptions. The statutory framework for the 10 communities program says cities and towns can include exemptions, and they don't say what they are. I'm pretty confident, again, based on conversations with DOER, that DOER being the state energy office, that our exemptions will be permissible. And so the third being labs and medical facilities. Again, we only exempted Newton Wellesley Hospital, and by statute, 10 communities program communities have to exclude labs and hospitals and medical facilities. So we have no flexibility there. I want to just call attention to one other provision that was in our home rule petition that based on conversations with our Newton's Inspectional Services Division, we decided to delete, which is the waiver provision. Our home rule petition included a waiver provision, and in conversations with ISD, we concluded that would simply be a nightmare to implement, and so excluded it. So that's where we are. The draft of the home rule petition that you have in your packet is one that I believe will be acceptable to DOER. And that ordinance has to be passed by the city council and submitted to DOER for its approval by September 1 of this year. Additionally, any communities that want to participate in the 10 communities program have to meet certain housing affordability requirements, which the planning department tells me they think is likely we will be able to do by September 1st, which is the 10B, the 40B 10% requirement. So let me stop there and just see if there are any questions.
Thank you very much. Councilor Baker, welcome.
Thank you. Sorry to be delayed here, but I'm glad to be here. I guess the question I have is about the waiver provision. I understand the challenges involved, but because the scope of substantial renovation is not clear to me, and the new construction I understand, but I'm curious about whether in fact there may need to be some waiver provision, and if it is a possibility under the arrangements that the state is allowing, why we shouldn't retain some capacity and for good cause to do that. I gather that ISD doesn't like it, but can we find some, we have waivers in other contexts where it just seems to me that might be a capacity that we ought to retain if it's permissible under the paramount state rule.
Well, we are joined this evening by Commissioner Lojek, who I would love to call on this matter. I'm guessing the way we wrote it in the home rule petition was a bit convoluted and would have been, as Lori said, a nightmare to try to implement. But
can we write it in a better way?
I don't know. I don't know if Ms. Berwick is saying that we simply cannot provide a waiver provision, or if we should ask Mr. Lojek to speak to this first.
Whatever you prefer.
Mr. Lojek.
Evening, Madam Chair. It's we don't know how this is going to go, and we aren't sure what these petitions for exemptions would be.
I understand.
But the thought was these could be all. These could be all over the lot and all sorts of complicated, and we just didn't want to be inundated with them because it is a dramatic change from what people are doing now. And, there's going to be people who take objection to it. And I think that if for no other reason than just more or less, and we have this happen a lot, just to voice their objection, they're going to file for an exemption.
Commissioner Lojek, can you?
And then the exemption, any decision of mine is appealable. It's appealable.
Commissioner Lojek, can you hear us?
Yes,
Okay, you're freezing off and on, but.
I know.
Sorry, can you, I know that that ISD has a clear understanding of what a level 3 renovation is and and what 50% is. Is it, well, okay, so tell, Councilor Baker's concern is that there's some.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
I mean, I could pitch in a little bit by saying two things. Number one, I'm really sympathetic to what Commissioner Lojek is saying. It's going to, we try to make this ordinance as, straightforward as possible. And if we introduce the possibility of waivers, then ISD has to start basically exercising a lot of discretion, no matter how clearly we write the waiver provision. And I'm just sympathetic to ISD's predicament in that situation. I think it could be a nightmare. I want to make sure that I distinguish between waivers and exemptions, right? As drafted, the proposed ordinance lists a number of exemptions, like for backup power, outdoor cooking, and outdoor heating, and some hot water in certain kinds of large buildings. So there's no question there will be exemptions. Waivers are a wholly different question. Right? It's a waiver means, well, you're not exempted, you're subject to the ordinance, but you have some extraordinary circumstance. And that leaves ISD to, evaluate whether this is an extraordinary enough circumstance to amount to a waiver situation. And that's asking a lot.
Well, can I
Please.
carry on? It seems to me that marble through our ordinances, though, are places in our zoning ordinance where we have the opportunity for special permits to do things that are not otherwise required. You have certainly the variance process in zoning, because you can have a hardship that is qualifies you for some relief. And the original home rule petition had a waiver provision in it. It may be
It did.
Yeah, and that it seems to me that we ought to preserve that opportunity as a concept. If there are questions about what the standards for waivers should be, we've had a whole conversation in this committee in other contexts about standards and how they can be drawn. But it does seem to me, because of the really very significant shift in what people are going to experience as a result of this, that there are going to be cases at the margin where there are going to need to be some opportunities. And I would be uneasy about adopting the ordinance if we didn't have that, because it's basically saying we're going to create a bright line rule for all circumstances that are the 50% or brand new construction, and there we are, and that's it. And I can just see that the members of this council sitting around the table are not going to hear the last of it from our constituents if that happens. And so it seems to me we ought to think through that in advance before we buy into this. That's all.
So Ms. Berwick, thank you, Councilor Baker. Ms. Berwick, the DOER hasn't said that under any circumstances we may not have a waiver.
It has said we may have a waiver.
We may have a waiver. They have said that we may have a waiver.
Yes. Well, it's in this. Yes, it's in the statutory scheme.
Okay, so possibly what we need to do is think through a few case possibilities. The notion, I mean, if a constituent wants to do a major renovation of their home, but they don't want to change their heating system, And they're gonna try and be lower than the 50% level 3 renovation. If they have an argument about whether they are or aren't with ISD, that's almost a separate matter, right? ISD.
Yeah, I mean,
Determine that, but let me just try and finish. So there may be a situation where somebody's very close to that, but can't get down underneath it, and it's the nature of the renovation doesn't necessarily need to.
Well, it's the question of the threshold of renovations, I understand, are both sometimes financial, sometimes square footage. I'm not sure exactly what the trigger is, but you know, again, I hate to use myself, I don't expect to do any renovations at all, but old houses
We
are,
know, Councilman.
have special problems, and especially historic ones. So I think that the point is, and we have waivers in our zoning ordinance, which have very limited standards, such as parking. City council can grant parking waivers without really any standard. So it seems to me, if it's permissible under state law, we shouldn't just go into this conversation assuming that we won't have any waivers. I would like to at least hold out the hope that we can figure out a way so that I think it'll help the ordinance actually become acceptable and work. That's part of my reason for it. I'm not, I think the policy behind it is a positive policy. I'm not in trouble with that. I just don't want us to get in a situation where we're all begin to get hearing from people who are saying, listen, this is a nightmare for me, and why are we doing this? And we said, well, we had a waiver, but we gave it up. You know, I don't want to have that conversation.
Okay, so I'm gonna suggest, thank you, I think we took the point, and maybe we need to do some more work on that. What I wanna, I don't see any other hands up at the moment. Ms. Berwick, you go ahead first. I don't want to talk about the calendar.
okay. Thank you, Chair Crossley. I think in talking about a waiver, there's sort of three quick things I want to say. One is a question of what the standards are for a waiver, right? And I don't think that's very difficult to write. We wrote it in the prior version. Another question is, who makes the decision? In the prior version, it was ISD. Does it have to be ISD? I don't know. And the third is, let's not conflate two different things. When we start talking about 50% renovations, that's governed anyway by the new stretch code and the specialized code. So I'm just not positive that the conversation we're having right now, we're not raising a bit of a red herring, but I think we're clearly going to need to revisit this.
I'm glad to substitute a different color herring, but anyway.
Okay, Director Heath.
Could we do a reserve section for waivers until we know a little bit more about what constitute a waiver in other communities and what suggestions DOER has? It seems like we're kind of operating in the dark a little bit right now.
We are, in fact, we need to be back into as part of the calendar discussion, really. Is like, how do we get from here to September 1st, which is something we need to talk about. And I know that Director Berwick has questions into Ian Finlayson of DOER that have not been answered yet. And this is, I don't know if this is another area for him. This may be an area where we need to put our heads together with ISD and some potential situations and how we might deal with them so we don't put our constituents in any kind of mess. The calendar. So I believe the memo is clear. We have to have our application into DOER by September 1st. And it has to include an ordinance that we have already passed. And we're proposing it to DOER. So this is, we do need to have a public hearing on this. We don't want to have public hearings generally in the summer. So that backs us up to June. We normally would have 2 meetings in June. The budget will be completed. So we're likely also going to have still a lot of work on village center zoning and possibly begin a public hearing process with that. However, there's a couple months in between. So working with DOER to get answers to some questions. about what exactly, for example, may be exempted, because we have a list of things. We don't know if they can all be approved. And then Commissioner Lojek, I hope you can sit down with us soon with the sustainability group, and we can talk through, perhaps Councilor Baker, you'd like to think about a couple of cases, or Councilor Leary, you were also on
I'm
the.
not expert enough. I just think that they're, as Burwick had indicated, there may have been the planning director. There may be guidance from other communities, there may be guidance from the state.
Sure.
I just think that to the extent we can take advantage of it, and I grant you, Ms. Berger is correct, the stretch code and the other amendment are a different animal here. But I just think that if we have the flexibility under state law, we ought to figure out whether we can exercise it wisely, and if so, how. That's all.
That's a good point. Thank you very much. So,
I just think the standard for an exemption should be very high bar, and the project would be.
You mean a waiver?
For a waiver, yes.
I don't
make it
disagree that there ought to be
reasonable.
some degree of hardship or good cause. It's just not standardless, but I think that there may be some guidance we can get to and figure out who should make the decision and how the decision should be made. That's all.
for ISD's sake, it needs to be.
Yeah,
crystal clear.
I thoroughly understand and sympathetic to the commissioner's
Yeah.
concern that if he just is handed a generalized
Yeah.
obligation, he's an administrator, not a discretionary body by definition. So I think it's hard to hand that easily to him as an official. I have very great confidence in Mr. Lodek would exercise good judgment, but that may not be institutionally where it belongs. That's all.
And he's told us that many times.
I got
All right.
this.
Yeah.
So we can. Like I said, I think we're headed toward public hearings in June if we want to continue down this path. I guess what I want to ask the committee first of all, and I'm sure
wanna
your answer is
continue
going to be
down
yes.
the path.
If you want to continue down this path, despite the fact that we now need to align with the model ordinance, the model rule. And assuming we can work out some of these other pieces, shall we go forward?
Yeah, we should try. We should try it.
I think you've got an opportunity. They really handed you a chance.
Yep.
And anytime we can get in front of Boston, I just think that's fun.
Well, I don't see
Yeah,
anyone
that's not
objecting,
policy.
so I think we're headed toward that. I think we'll have to decide at another meeting what date we would hold a public hearing, but if we're moving forward, we've got to hold public hearings no later than June.
All right, but can we get a recommendation from the planning department, Ms. Berwick, about all of that? And on an
Yes.
accelerated basis, I assume.
Yes,
Because the
we'll
more
need to
people
hear.
understand about this before you hit the end of the.
What I might even do is if in May, when we have our budget meeting, which is one of the late ones, because we'll need, if we have a public hearing, we're gonna have to notice it in advance, obviously. And we've got to get all that done by the end of June, so possibly as a tag on to our budget meeting. We can see if we can get our information back by then, and our budget meeting isn't till the end of April.
End of May.
End of May, I'm sorry, end of May in this committee, so I'm sorry, end of May, I apologize. So we have a fair amount of time. We should be able to get our work done.
I mean, if they can have the draft of it figured out and have something to present at the public hearing, it'd be a nice thing to do.
Well, we have to file the ordinance with the notice of a public hearing. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. When we can modify it a bit, but we have to file it. Okay, so Council Ryan.
Question,
Yep.
are we gonna meet the 40B threshold for that? too?
We still don't know, but it looks good.
Because we
There's
have to.
one, so the question is, are we gonna meet the 40B threshold that's gonna allow us to stay in the game? There is one project that we're counting on, that's going for 40B, and it's, the Northland proposal for 400 units on Needham Street. They're pretty far down the road, but, they're not being heard again in the ZBA until their April meeting. So, and they're doing some, I don't know what they're doing. They're doing some modifications to the design or something. I
That's right.
believe. Yeah,
That they're gonna present at the April. meeting.
Yeah.
Correct. And there
so,
are other 40Bs that are imminently to be filed, so.
okay, but they have to be granted, they have to be decided. So this is the one that because they're so far down the road that it will put us over the threshold if it goes through.
Is that Northland 40B though, if they're gonna make the modifications that CBA recommended?
I don't know if they will.
Stay tuned.
Yeah,
They
because
could
it's-
put their foot down and say, no,
Well,
we think it's great the way it is.
When people, there's enough people on each side of that. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that's gonna be smooth and get us over the threshold in time.
Well, we should talk about that another day.
Just saying.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, so I have a motion to hold this item from Councilor Leary.
Yes, motion to hold.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Any opposed or abstentions? No. Director Berwick and Attorney Lee, thank you so much, and Commissioner Lojek as well for visiting us on this item. And we'll be back in touch really soon. Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, we now, and thank you to the next group for, I'm sorry if there was a bit of a communication. I hated to make, those folks wait all night, for what was a pretty succinct presentation. All right, next. We are back on 3822, discussion and review relative to the draft zoning ordinance regarding village centers. And as I wrote in the chair's note, we're going to begin with, if not spend the entire rest of the meeting on a proposal from staff and the housing division of the planning department is included in that. Is Amanda Berman with us tonight?
She's not, but we do have a member of the housing partnership that had an opportunity to take a look at
Excellent.
this.
And with
Chuck
the,
Eisenberg.
oh, terrific. And the Newton Housing Partnership have come up with and done a deep dive analysis on a very specific recommendation for something we've talked about for a while, providing a density bonus for projects in the village center overlay districts that would provide a higher percentage of affordable housing units. So who's going to begin this
So I'll
discussion?
kick it off, and then Zach, and we have our sub-consultants here as well to make a brief presentation. John Trementozzi from Landwise, who's presented before this committee before as
Yes,
part of village
Yeah.
center zoning. So, and it's been very helpful that he has the background and experience with Newton and what we're working on so that this analysis could happen relatively quickly. Also, as I mentioned before, two members of the housing partnership, Chuck Eisenberg and David Rockwell, both of whom are experienced in housing development and housing affordable development in particular, were part of the analysis, were part of the meetings that we had where we were looking at this. They've reviewed in depth the assumptions that underlie the resulting recommendations, and I'm sure Chuck could speak to that at the appropriate time as well. But I think we are ready for a presentation from John Trementozzi from Landwise.
Yeah, just I'll turn it over to John, and I think just to highlight the proposal, everything was in your packet and provided. I think it's a fairly straightforward, but given that John from Landwise provided the analysis, I think it's better to speak to where we landed and then go from there with questions.
Hi, everyone. So Zach, do you want me to actually go through the material in a presentation form?
We can put up a slide or two if that's helpful for you. Otherwise, I think whatever you think is easiest.
Sure. I'm gonna share my screen here. Is that possible?
yes.
Okay.
I'm hoping that although we've read the material, there's a lot of people on this call who probably haven't or may not have. And if you can summarize it as though you're speaking to folks who, from the beginning.
Sure. Happy to do that. I'll try to keep it sort of
Okay,
relatively high level and not too much into the weeds, and then we can sort of get into any, I guess, questions that folks have. Is that screen visible?
yes, but
Yes.
could you hold for just a second? I have a question. Council Wright?
So I do have a lot of questions on here. Do you want to go by page or do you want to wait to the end or how do you want?
I
to
would
do it?
love for Mr. Trementosi to give us his full summary and then hold questions.
Okay.
Sure. So the first thing I'll say is that, you know, this work, you know, really builds off of some of the Village Center work that was done last year, led by UTIL, and thinking through, you know, how the zoning could potentially change in these locations. Our role was to run sort of generic pro forma models for some of the different test fits that UTIL was producing to get a sense for, you know, which versions may or may not be financially feasible under these assumptions. And so for this round, the idea was again to test some different kind of sample generic projects and get a sense for if we were to allow additional height and density in these locations, how much additional affordable housing might be supportable within those projects. So that was sort of what we were focused on testing here. So these three different kind of test fit scenarios that you'll see were developed by UTIL, and then our role was to run them through the financial pro forma to understand what level of affordability could be achievable for these projects. So what you see on this first slide are essentially the three different scenarios. You know, this is a real site, but it's a you know, it's sort of a generic project where we're testing levels of density. So we've named these three options: base condition, option 1, and option 2. And so the idea is that you know, the base condition would be what's allowable by right, perhaps, and then as you add additional square footage in units and an extra level on each option, you see how far you can push the affordability. So that's what we were testing here. So essentially what you'll see is that we, in order to test these different scenarios, we had to make some assumptions about both the form of the building as well as the parking solution. As you know, parking can drive form and economics of development. And so for this exercise, we were testing a 0.75 per unit parking ratio for the base condition. And then we pushed that slightly lower to a 0.5 for the other two higher density scenarios. Additionally, UTIL was trying to understand, you know, how those parking spaces would be configured, how many of them can be done at a surface level, and how many of them might need to be accommodated in an underground structure situation, which obviously is nice from an urban form perspective and obviously more expensive. So that's what we were testing. So you can see these are just some of the numbers about for each of the scenarios, how many units you would be able to achieve. So it sort of ranges from 48 in the base condition up to 82 in the first option, and then up to 98 units in the second option. Additionally, you'll see the colors here. The yellow is the residential portion. The sort of pinkish color you'll see at the ground level is some sort of ground level active use, be it restaurant, retail, or something like that, in order to keep the street front activated. So in running the numbers on those scenarios, what we tried to do is we said, okay, under the base condition, under the current requirement for affordable units, you're able to support, or if you have 17.5% affordability at a 65% AMI, how does this project look? And so for the base condition, we were able to show that project is financially feasible. You're typically the target where we look at the level of return for that kind of project is a kind of a 5.5 return on cost. 6 is, some developers will tell you 6, but others will say 5.5. But essentially anything north of 6 is certainly financially feasible. So that project looks strong, but it's only producing 8 affordable units, right? Under that situation. When we push into option 1, we add an additional level we give a little bit of a larger footprint. And as a result, we want to see, okay, how much affordability can that scenario support? So what we did essentially was to lock in the value that's created to the developer. And so it's still attractive. It still is achieving a return that they can live with. But how many additional units does it support? And so in this case, we found that it's somewhere in the range of 30%. So you had 8 affordable units in the first scenario, you've got up to 25 in the option 1. So the extra density pushes those affordable units up by about 16 additional units. And then we do the same thing in option 2. You push it up another floor higher, sort of to the point that, you know, might be the max level of density that folks could be comfortable with, and you see how many additional units does that yield, while still making sure that the developer is whole and getting a achievable or a comfortable return. And so that we found we could push it up as high as 33 units, and about 34% of the overall units are affordable. So that's the exercise. And again, there's a substantial number of some assumptions and inputs that go into this. We built off the work that was done last year with a few modifications. One thing that I'll say is that one thing that allows these costs on these buildings to be a little bit lower than what we tested last year is the parking percentage. So the 0.75 or the 0.5 spaces per unit is lower than what we tested last year. It's, I think, lower than what most of the recent projects have been building. And so obviously that saves a cost for the developer and makes these buildings slightly more attractive. So I'm gonna stop there. I think that's kind of the crux of the analysis. You know, happy to speak to, I think, any of the other kind of underlying assumptions for folks who have reviewed it and have specific questions, rather than droning on through the additional work. We did the same analysis for VC2. It's in a very similar fashion, and it had similar results to this one.
John, let me, if I can, jump in here. Just so this is, you know, how we got to our proposal, and I want to make sure our proposal is very clear as it was put in the memo. What we're talking about here is an additional floor for option 1 plus a 2,500 square foot footprint bonus, and for option 2, an additional floor above that, so 2 additional floors. And what we're recommending is that at option 1, you have to require a minimum of provide 25% of those units to be affordable. And in option 2, it's 30%. So what John is showing is, you know, where does the threshold, you know, what does the analysis show? We're recommending that option 1 be set at 25%. And as you look in the memo, you'll see that that's what it says, and 30% for option 2.
Can we put that up on the screen?
If you stop sharing, then Jacqueline, maybe you could put up the memo.
Jack, is the workforce housing gone? Because there's an add-on to the 17.5% that brings it up higher for workforce housing.
How many units does that get?
2.5%.
I think these are I don't think it goes away. Obviously, I think we would need to align it with our IZ, but just at the very base level, what we're saying is with these bonuses, you could require a project to provide 25% or 30% of their units be affordable at an average of 65% AMI, period. There's no city subsidy provided. That is just what the numbers and analysis are showing here.
Okay, so I had, are you all set?
I'm all set.
Great, thanks. I had Councilor Wright first.
Okay, I want to understand the math a little bit better. So the first thing is, in this example, and I think it's a bad example, is that you're using a lot of 35,900 square feet, which is a special permit, because it's not below 30,000. So it wouldn't be by right, this project.
This specific lot, but I think, again, the modeling, and John maybe could speak to that, it's really a generalization of what could be allowed in the VC3 zone.
And we allow multiple buildings on lots, and this is quite a big lot. Why wasn't there additional buildings on here?
No reason.
Okay, and the building footprint is more than is allowed. At least I'm looking at, on page. Oh, you don't have, there's no page
It's
number.
right here. Right.
Not that one, but, the other one, I was just, the building footprint on the base condition, you had 12,847, but, I was just wondering how you got that when the maximum is 15,000, and is it parking the gating factor? I wonder if you had it all underground, would that be different? So I just wanted, and then, so then your footprint is 12,847, but then your retail is only 7,370. So how did that come up? So that's, you know, we think of the whole first floor as retail, and here is, I don't know, about 60% or so retail, and how did that come up? Decide on those numbers. And if you go down a couple of pages.
Are these questions that can be answered in order so that folks don't get confused?
I'm looking at the attachments here. So in this one here. So you're looking at here, and then right at the top there, the lot area is 35,900. So that, I think it's a bad sample because it's not under 30,000. But then the footprint, I don't understand where the maximum footprint for VC3 is 15,000. So why did you, especially when you have such a big lot, why did you only use, where you're allowed even multiple buildings on that lot? Why 12,847? What was the gating factor that it's smaller than what's?
Let's let John answer that since he's the one that developed this scenario.
John, my understanding is it's parking, because when you start to underground parking, it really adds an extreme amount of cost and starts to play with your numbers. And in this case, this is a real scenario. We allow a maximum of 15,000 square feet in VC3. That's on paper. When you actually get to a site, that's when you determine the actual size. So this is a real case study, a test fit, and that's why it's a little bit under. And I guess simply, it's probably the parking.
Okay, just because Santander is, I think, 32,000, and their the lot is around that, and their footprint is 17,000. And that's a real example,
Yeah.
which is, you know, less stories than they have here and less affordable housing. So, which is going forward at some point. Maybe John can answer why the retail space isn't the full first story, and how do you come up with that? It's, I don't know what that number is, what, 60% of the total first floor? And what else will be on the first floor then?
Yeah, that one I can't. So first off, I'll just say I'm not an urban designer. I'm more on the economic market side of things. So UTIL is really the one driving the designs of the buildings. But I can say on the retail portion, I think the intent there is that, you know, there's some sort of active, you know, street level use, which I think, you know, generally folks want, and I think you know, everyone here probably understands is kind of good urban development principle. But I think the reality is that developers have a hard time filling those spaces in an efficient way during this market, right? Retail has had a lot of kind of headwinds and challenges. So the idea that you could get enough of a use there to have it be active and create a really kind of vertically integrated mixed use environment, but still get some residential use on the ground level to try to make the building as efficient as it can be. From a financial perspective, that's kind of the thinking on the retail.
So I think right now what we're proposing though, in village center zoning, is the first floor is all commercial. Is that, so then we would need to change it and say a certain percentage is commercial?
It's not a requirement.
Well, I thought it's a requirement if you have the extra floors.
No, well, Zach, can you?
These extra
how far
floor
down the street it is.
Yeah, I think there's these extra floor bonuses are only tied to more affordable units.
But even just if in VC3, if it was not in the commercial district, oh yeah, it's 4.5 stories. Okay. So some more. Okay, let me just go down. So how do you determine underground parking and how much? And I know some of these were a mix, underground and surface parking.
Yeah, so the way I know, I mean, I know how UTL did that because, you know, I worked with them on making sure I understood the numbers. So the idea there was, you know, if you could get surface parking in, that it, you know, it makes sense from sort of a development economics perspective. It, you know, brings the price down, but not to an extent that it, you know, makes the site sort of too unsightly, or you know, doesn't produce enough square footage to make the thing work. So it's a striking a balance there. So the idea was to first use surface parking on a certain portion, and then use underground to accommodate whatever additional spaces were required based on that parking ratio. So that's kind of how they were approaching it.
And then on Santander for the retail, I mean, for the rental, it's all underground, and the retail was on the first floor. So in this example, you could put all of it underground. I mean, you should run the numbers again, because in the real world example for Santander, they have the residential all underground.
Sure,
So-
and we've run plenty of scenarios like that. The earlier iterations of the VC numbers, the majority of the parking was underground at the $100,000 per space level. So yeah, we've certainly looked at that as well, and we can share those numbers. You'll see, you know, with the additional sort of density bonus, as the footprint gets a little bit larger, you know, more spaces do get pushed underground as well.
So, and I hear though, costs running from 50,000 to 100,000 for a parking space underground, and you're saying minimum 100,000?
So we used our assumptions were anywhere from 50 to 100, but we're using 50 more for like a structured or sort of podium style parking, if it's like a tuck under situation, and then for a truly underground space, 100,000. Those are the numbers that we were using in this analysis.
Okay. I mean, some developers haven't been having that high. I mean, that's their high range, but their lower range, I've been hearing, is lower than that. In a couple more pages down, there's a couple of terms I'm not as familiar with. So keep going down. Wait. Stop there once. Okay, that's the page. So what residential efficiency, what does that exactly mean? What's the definition of that?
Yeah, so the idea there is just within the kind of residential footprint, how much of the space is actually within a unit, right? So how much is actually kind of rentable or sellable, with the other 20% being, you know, circulation and other portions of the building that aren't actually rentable.
So on that page, you have the average unit size at 798, but at the beginning, if you do the calculation, you have it at 884. So I was wondering why there was a little bit of the discrepancy between those two numbers.
I'm not sure about the 884. The 800 is like the pure sort of leasable portion. So that would be, you know, if you're the tenant in this building, you have 800 or 798 usable feet. The sort of net number is probably closer to 1,000. Sorry, the gross number is probably closer to 1,000. So I'm not sure where the 884 comes from, but 800 is what we're using for the leasable square footage per unit.
Okay, I just did the calculations where you had, you said the number of at the beginning, the number of housing units were 48, and your housing area is 47,886. And so if you do that math there, you get the one number, and then here you state another number. So I just didn't understand it. And if you were doing the 80%, that didn't work out with this example and the numbers that you're using for the total for the.
I'll have to go back and look at that. I don't know, but it should be 800 as the usable square footage, and then if you at 80% efficiency, so obviously it's more like 1,000 on the gross, and then you also have to back out the retail. But I can go back and look at the numbes, but I'm not sure. It's hard to do the calculations in real time.
I like math and data, and the numbers don't correlate, so that.
I'm happy to unpack it with you, you know, in another setting when I can actually like calculate it.
Yep, and then the next thing is where you're using, the rent, what is the parking cost? I noticed in the different, how many stories, you know, the parking cost, sometimes you have 5,000 and another one, 57,250.
Sure. So that goes back. So the numbers to have in your head. So that's just based on the parking type. So the 5,000 is just for a surface, like for a surface spot. And then, as I said before, 50,000 for a sort of podium or kind of general structure type space, and then 100,000 for true underground. And so if you're seeing a number like 57,000, that's just sort of the average of all the different typologies, based on whatever the mix is of that particular scenario, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it'd be nice to have maybe a little definition before going through all this, because I would not have figured that one out.
Sure.
Then one of the other things is how much per square foot that you used in your calculations. And so Toll Brothers came up with the price per square foot. And if you look at the latest 3 projects that they provided, 28 Trio, you don't have that here, but I can provide it later. And overlook at St. Gabriel's, their what the rents are per square foot is much higher than what you're using.
Which construction costs, I think.
No, there was somewhere what the residential rent per square foot there. So their residential rent ranges from 4.45 on the low end to 6.04 on the high end, which would change your calculations. And I think using more recent projects, I think would be a better thing to use.
So when you say 604, you mean that's a number for like the smallest, for like a studio unit?
So for a 2-bedroom, ranged from 4.51 to 6.04 per square foot. For a 1-bedroom, it ranged from 4.45 to 5.10. A 3-bedroom was 4.42 to 4.64.
Sure. So I'd be happy to look at those numbers. I don't have that particular example you're referring to, but the important thing would be to calculate it all down to the weighted average, right? So the higher end of the range might not mean a whole lot, like, but looking at that and seeing what the weighted average would be helpful. If they're closer to $5 or something, that'd be good to know.
Okay. And then.
Can I ask a question about that one?
Yeah.
So it feels to me like you're going for an average, like if you're gonna have a unit that's running from, let's say, 700 square feet to 1,500 square feet unit size. But there's usually the smaller ones are more plentiful than the larger ones, based on what I've been seeing. So are your numbers more like an average?
Yeah, it's just a weighted average, exactly. So the way to think about it is if we're using 4.6 here, the larger units, if there are 3 bedrooms, for example, those would be less, maybe that's 4 or something like that. And then, on a studio or a smaller unit, you're going to be higher. You could be in the 5s, right? And then depending on the mix, you put it all together and say, what's the weighted average of all of those units? So that the 4.6 would be the average number.
Councilor Wright, that might be a better way to think about it, that he's giving us average numbers.
Yeah, but my thing is my numbers start at 4.42 on the low end, and the smaller bedroom counts are at the higher end to begin with, and doing a weighted. So what he's using is 4.6, and I think that should be looked at, and I think.
Yeah, so just one word on that. So I think, and I don't know if we preface it enough. So, this work, I think we've updated it since last year, but there wasn't like an extensive interviewing process with the development community in this last month or so. Obviously construction costs have been all over the map recently, and things shift rapidly. But I think we can certainly, if you have newer data on a project or two, we can certainly use it. But I think it'll be different on both the revenue and the cost side slightly.
Yeah, so this is actually back from November, and again, it's from Toll Brothers when they were presenting their 40B on Route 9. So that's part of their documentation, but I will share it.
So before you I think it's important to note how crazy the construction costs are these days. I mean, there's big changes from last winter, in 2022 to now, huge changes. And the market's extremely uncertain.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose we can continually go to try to find the most recent numbers, but that
Yeah.
makes sense because construction costs actually could go down.
So I understand it with construction costs, and I would hope that we wouldn't be using construction costs right now because no one's building because
That's
it's
right,
crazy.
that's right.
But rents are almost always going up, and what I'm saying here, the rents that you could get for that should be higher in these calculations, because you should be using the the newer buildings so that.
I'm not a statistician, and I guess what might be helpful, and I get all your points, you're looking at data from a particular developer, and the numbers are very different.
Yeah.
From a particular developer in one of his projects, so. The folks from the Newton Housing Partnership might also be helpful in weighing in on this, because the two folks who are joining us tonight, I don't know if you're prepared to have something to say before we continue our conversation, but I attended the Newton Housing Partnership meeting and I found your discussion to be very helpful. I'm not a statistician or a marketing person, and I don't run these kinds of numbers.
Yeah.
My big question at that meeting was, how do you know? Where do you sort of put your stake in the
Before
ground?
we go there, can I ask a question just to frame an answer from some of them that they were the.
Sure,
Yes.
sure.
It seems to me that there's sort of two ways we can go at this, which is to say, okay, let's check some of the assumptions and do they hold up and all, but the basic question, it seems to me, is what do you in effect offering as a bonus in terms of development opportunity in order to get some additional affordability? And then the question is, what is the effect on the built environment of doing that, right? Because if it were a costless thing and we said, sure, more affordable is great, then we can do that, that'd be fine. But what I'm hearing is the financial analysis says, well, you probably have to give up some of your at least current parking requirements. You have to give more footprint than you currently have, and you got to go up. Now, I don't know the sensitivity analysis of any of those variables in this model, but I think part of the question that is sort of the big question in the committee is, does this make sense? I mean, while we're getting some additional affordability, we're doing it in a built environment that's going to be a very long-term change, different from what we had expected the built environment to be. And part of the value of the of Util's analysis initially was to say, well, if we're going to do this, we think it ought to be done with this framework and this big but no bigger. Now we're saying, because of something particularly valuable internal to the building, not in the sense of otherwise, it just means we've got some more affordable units, which is certainly a positive thing. We're going to change the effective envelope that we would otherwise ask for. I'm not persuaded that's yet a wise choice. I mean, whether we run those numbers one way or another, but I'd like to understand that idea, because it does seem to me it's a very important conceptual foundation. It certainly gives a greater public benefit to the city. But if we're trying to say, how does this fit into the streetscape? Is it the place we want to invest additional development opportunity? We may, and there may be a threshold that says you get to 25% if you do this and that, and you can play the sensitivity game out and then see what really is going to do it. But the question for me is a bigger one, which is literally to say, what are we doing to the streetscape in order to do this? And is it going to fit into that context well, or is there some other standard we should look at before we would say this is a place we apply what amounts to a development bonus for the benefit that's provided? I don't know the answer to that, but that's the kind of framework that I'd like to ask.
Well, I actually think that was a very helpful summary of the issues in front of us, because sure, checking the data is important, but from a policy point of view, that's exactly the discussion we need to have tonight is, is the potential to get more affordable units I guess you're gonna say worth the additional building footprint and height that we would have to give in order to achieve that, and where we're proposing it, is that the right place?
Those are questions I don't know the answer.
We have that discussion every time we're in ZAP. That's all is foremost in everyone's mind.
But with my question kind of coming from it and looking at the data and the numbers and what's being used, can we take everything down one story? Why do we have to be there? You know, if they're gonna get more per square foot for rent, you know, the numbers that they're meeting over there will change. And so that's a question that I would have. And then I think Cambridge is doing, aren't they doing 100% affordable buildings? And Houston said, if you're adding a bonus for affordability, it actually only works at 100% affordable buildings. This was done by profit developers. It would be interesting to run this for nonprofit developers too.
You can see the profit margins. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, they're pretty
Yeah.
small.
John, maybe you have something to add.
Yeah.
Yeah, just one thing I want, so I think the discussion of the issues there, I think Mr. Baker that mentioned it, I think that's the right way to think about it. And, you know, we've run many of these models for many years in markets all over Boston. And I think what I want to emphasize is that the assumptions are always wrong. They're always, you know, a little bit outdated, but they're within a margin of error, right? So like you could tweak any of these numbers up or down 10%, but essentially the answer is the same, right? So like, I don't want folks to think like, hey, if we change this number, change that number, all of a sudden, you know, we're gonna double the amount of affordability. That's not how it works. You know, so you're gonna be tinkering with it, but you're essentially just gonna be pushing it a little bit in one way or the other. So I just want to mention that to folks that, you know, we can debate the inputs ad nauseum, but it's only gonna change us at the margins. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you for that. So I actually would love to hear from the members of the Newton Housing Partnership, especially the issue in front of us has been framed so well. I see, who do I see? Chuck Eisenberg.
Yeah.
Please tell us your thoughts and actually if you can address some of the issues that have been raised that are our policy decisions we have to make, but also wrap that around sort of the conversations you've had in the partnership.
Yeah, what we asked, I mean, we started with the assumption, being the partnership, that we wanted to figure out a way to get more affordability into the projects, particularly since these are village centers. And this was an opportunity to see if amongst the other benefits that we could get from providing as-of-right development, that we could get more affordability. This is, by the way, this is all affordable on the same standards as the current inclusionary zoning, which means it averages out at 65% of area median income. It can be lower, it can be a mix of lower and higher, up to 80%. We asked to model it out. We asked for a conservative model, and some of the questions that have been raised, I think, relate to that, because we didn't, frankly, want to look like we were packing this thing, the allowance with more, you know, it's more than was realistic. We wanted this to be something which would be something that developers wouldn't just exist on paper, but that developers would actually be willing to do. So, you know, the fact that the rents may or may not be lower, I'd rather that they were a little low than a little bit high, frankly, and that we came up with a percentage that in the real world nobody was going to do anything with. The number of stories is a function of the more stories we have, the more affordability we can get in. We wanted the opportunity to do more than when we came out with 25%. We figured that was you know, most of these lots, that's a big lot that you're seeing modeled. Most of the lots are smaller. Most of the buildings are going to be smaller. And we wanted to try and pick up some units. You know, it's hard to get a lot of affordable units, 5, 10, 15 at a time. It doesn't add up quickly. And so that extra story does make a big difference. This is you know, the from the partnerships perspective, there aren't that the opportunities. We're concerned about the opportunities for affordable housing in Newton. If we do go out over 40Bs 10%, that shuts off one lane for affordability. Just costs and interest rates are making it even harder. And you know, as market rate housing becomes more and more expensive, it becomes more and more difficult for people to rent in this city if they don't make 6 figures. To be quite blunt, that's what you need today to rent market rate housing in the city of Newton. So we're trying to look at everything, and this was one of the things we were looking at. The one other thing that's been disappointing, when you get around to looking at the MBTA zoning, they put a cap on affordability. And in Newton's case, it will be the existing inclusionary zoning. And we may figure out a legal way to get around that, but so far it hasn't happened. So a lot of the ways of getting affordable rental housing are closing off, and we thought that this was a reasonable thing to ask. It's not putting a tremendous amount of, from my perspective, okay? It's not adding a tremendous amount of mass. It's not going to change the character of the villages substantially, particularly since we've tried to be sensitive to the concept of the V3, of the 2 and 1, and we're not in the 1 at all with this. That's how we got to where we are. I mean, if we'd done it as a ideological exercise, we'd have probably gone for 10 or 12 stories.
Okay, thank you very much. The other gentleman who's with us this evening, anything to add? Oh, he's not here.
No.
Okay, all right, thank you so much for that perspective. Did you have something to say, staff, before?
I did, just real
Okay,
quickly.
please.
I know even before we discussed this, there was a thread of comment about whether or not we had the building size right at 15,000. And we ought to provide some sort of avenue to expand the building. I think there was some discussion about a special permit for another 2,500, because that's the piece that we've been kind of carrying through. So I think the thinking here is, yeah, there is an avenue to get another 2,500 square feet and to go up a level. But the only way you do that is you provide a significant amount more of affordable housing. I think that's what you get in return here. It's pretty simple.
Yeah.
So can I go ahead?
Yeah, I had Councilor Baker wanting to finish.
Let me just, I think this is part of Councilor Baker's question.
Okay.
The options are, there are 2 options. There's a 1-story and a 2-story. And I haven't heard anybody talking about the 2-story. So we need to factor that into this and these answers as well.
So, yes, I would just, again, I'll restate what the proposal is. So at both options, this is for VC3 and VC2. Option 1 is additional story, plus the footprint can expand by 2,500 square feet above the maximum. If to take advantage of that, 25% of the units need to be affordable. Option 2 is the same thing, but with 2 stories, not 1, and they have to provide 30% of the units affordable. That's the proposal.
2 stories on top of the VC3 or VC2?
Yeah.
VC3 or VC2. And again, what we're talking, that's less than 1% of the city that we're talking about here.
Thank you. It's up on the screen now at this point, so the policy recommendation, which is a little less for everybody who's
Mr.
watching.
Eisenberg comment on, he only commented on one story. Mr. Eisenberg, could you comment on option 2? What did the Newton Housing Partnership say about that?
No, I'm sorry for being unclear. No, we approve both of them.
Okay.
We think 2 stories is not a significant imposition, and the extra 5% affordability is consequential.
And just to be clear here, the plus 2,500, it's not plus 2,500 plus 2,500. It's only, that stays constant between the two. I just want to make sure that's clear.
Got it. And it's per floor, obviously, because it's footprint.
Correct.
Yeah. Councilor Baker.
So I think here's the problem I guess I'm having is that the driver for this, according to what I heard from Mr. Eisenberg, is that it gets us additional affordability, and the more development opportunity you have, the more affordability you get, which I understand. I mean, it's a pretty straightforward calculation. The question I have is that additional affordability, as valuable as it is, it's a small number of units, worth the change in our structure where we work really quite hard to try and keep the scale of the buildings into a lower scale. Now, we may say, yes, it is. I mean, it's a public benefit that we're clear about, I think, and I think there's a unanimity among members of the council that that's generally a good policy. And indeed, when we went through the whole conversation with the building over at Newtonville, not Trio, but the one, I'm sorry. Austin Street, I just had a blank from that. That was part of the threshold of our special permit conversation. But that justified that structure in that context. And I guess my concern is that if there were some way that I could say, all right, either the increase in space or the decrease in parking is somehow not just an economic judgment, which produces more affordability, but has some sense. And I don't see that. I would be uneasy about trying to say, well, people who use affordable units don't drive as much or something like that. I think you want to have everybody have an equal opportunity. That's what we try to do, I think, in our building envelopes. And that's true, right? I mean, we don't try and distinguish the quality of the unit or the opportunity the unit provides simply because of what the income of the occupant is. That's a separate and a wholly, sort of a private matter almost. You just know though that they're there, but you don't single people out and say, you're the affordable unit. You're not. So I think that's a really important policy. And so I guess I'm not yet persuaded that the value of the additional affordability is worth the change in the envelope. I certainly don't think the 2 stories goes there. The 1 story I might be persuaded by, but I would be more persuaded by it, I think, if we're limited to VC3. I'm a little uneasy about, because the VC2 is we're trying to make this as much, as I recall it, a transition, where you're staging down. So at least the VC3, you have a presumption that this is the tallest part, and it's going to be kind of skyline section of the outcome. In that context, I could see inappropriate cases, but I would like to just ask if there's a way that there's any site-specific analysis that could allow us to say this is a great location for that, as opposed to a location that might not be wise, but that gets us into special permits rather than the whole idea of as of right. So I'm groping, frankly. I don't have an answer for you, but I would like to have a sense that in return for this important public benefit, that the impact in the built environment is not going to be an adverse one, that we think the trade-off is not wise in retrospect. That's all.
Thank you. Well, and I do think that's exactly what's before us in the conversation that we need to have and are having. Right. I do want to ask one question before I go to Councilor Leary. By putting this forward in this way, and let's say we adopted this as part of the VCOV districts or any piece of it, does that count toward our MBTA communities calculation? Or is this a separate?
I believe it is separate, the bonus would be separate and apart, but I'd want to get definitive clarity on that.
Yeah, I would too. And then, I mean, I think we're obviously gonna hold this tonight, but we're gonna need to think about this too with respect to the other areas of the city we now know we have to look at as part of figuring out the MBTA compliance picture. And I understand. I've read all the memos. I get it. I get where we have to go. We have a lot of work to do, but I don't know that that means that we stick with the same 3 VC districts, or do we develop another one? So I'm just gonna throw that out there because I think there's, just from tonight, there's gonna be a lot to chew on. And when we get through Wednesday night too, and that material, which I thought was very well presented and clear, but it raises a lot of questions and a lot of work ahead. So, and Councilor Leary.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just going to speak to Councilor Baker's questions, which seem to be judgments and sort of thinking about our values, what's important, what the future is for our village centers. And the driver is more affordability. That's definitely one of the things why we're looking to build a little bit higher and a little bit denser. And I think our village centers are wholly appropriate for that. But I also want to include that this would also mean, besides meeting housing goals, that it would also meet a lot of our climate goals, greenhouse gas emissions. It would mean more consumers, more shoppers for our local retailers. It would mean we're encouraging more bike and pedestrian access and more car light living. Those are all really important things to me. And I'm not willing to sacrifice good design, public space, gathering spaces, more green spaces, more trees, active ground floor retail, things like that. So I'm looking at that whole picture, and my answer is somewhere in here is what I want. And I can't tell you exactly. I know I see it, but this is a really good start to start thinking about it and modeling it. And as I said, this is just an average, a model. There's a lot of other, you can see changes here. But I'm happy with the direction that we're going. And I think our village centers are, some of them anyway, are very appropriate for 4 and 5 stories, at least. But I don't want that to come at any kind of decrease in our quality of life. Okay. And I think there's a balance there. And it's just, I think you and I, it's just a different balance. That's all.
We might come up with the same balance. I haven't made up my mind on it.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to respond to that because it really is, a lot of it is sort of a judgment call, but it has to be based on economic realities too. And that's why I'm so supportive of reducing parking, because that's really a huge factor in whether a project will work or not. And to do that, you have to build in places where people can walk, where they can walk around and buy things, where they can walk to transit, where they can have access to bike lanes, where they can walk to the train or the bus. So that's why the density really is appropriate in those areas. I don't want to see the sprawl. I don't like a lot of density in a neighborhood where like, for example, Oak Hill Park. I mean, there's no public transit out there, so that's where I'm coming from. And of course, the devil is in the details. That's why it really would help to have some even more specific examples and learn from what we've already built.
So,
but a qualitative person, Pam's the quantitative person.
Councilor Wright.
So my whole perspective in doing the math is, can we take everything down a story or even 2 and still have the 30% affordable? The 7 stories now can be 108 feet tall, which is taller than a lot of steeples in the village center. And And, these, some counselors say, oh, it's not gonna happen, it's not gonna happen. Well, we're seeing the pressure in Newtonville and West Newton, with whole blocks and owners of whole blocks. And it's gonna be more like, to me, it'll feel more like we're gonna be a city of 13 cities instead of 13 villages. 100 feet, I don't consider really a village.
We're talking about 7 stories. We're talking.
Yeah, we're talking about something.
Well, we're talking, what I see mostly is 4.5, 5.5, 6.5. The most.
Yeah, 6.5 is 7 stories at the top part. So, which is, I think, 108 or 110 feet. And that's, with new floors, and if you look at old buildings, that's more like 10 stories, just the feel of it. New buildings are much taller. One of the things which I have shared with planning is, setting back the second floor, and which Brookline's doing versus having everything setting back the the top floor, which to me gives a little bit more breathing room and, yeah.
Sorry, you're talking about a physical setback.
Yeah, and so how we have the setback right now, we're saying on the top floor,
Okay.
and in Brookline on Harvard Street, I'm volunteering in Brookline schools right now. So I'm down in Brookline a lot, and on Harvard Street, they want to put their MBTA communities, I think they need 13,000 units by right, and they want to put it on Harvard Street. And if they can't have the commercial, it's just going to wreck that whole corridor, I think. But they are building new buildings and which are mixed use there, and they're pulling back the second floor. So you still have, it's next door to a 1-story building. So you still have, and I'll share the pictures with you. I took some pictures. You still have that same feeling, so it's not so much in your face versus like in Alston. And there's an example there that it's, just straight up and the top floor is
You have to
recessed
be
back.
careful about, I think, about looking at it one particular environment, though. I mean, Harvard Street is much narrower than West Newton. West Newton is the outlier in our community and has a very wide, streetscape that doesn't give you a sense of enclosure or a sense of place at all. So whereas Harvard Street in Brookline, I know very well, and it's much narrower, and so you get that with a much lower building. So, the idea, I don't know that they require that, maybe they do, but the idea of setting back a second story actually can have some aesthetic value.
But a lot of our other villages have narrower streets. I mean, yes, West Newton's the outlier.
I mean, then you go to Europe and they're beautiful, wonderful, active streets that are, so I think it's all relative, but it's the quality of the environment is something that we have to come to terms with relative to having a healthy community economically and socially and all of that. So
I was just gonna answer Councilor Wright's question about, could we require more affordability without these bonuses? And I think the answer is no. Like, there was an analysis done that got us to the 17.5% through our IZ. John and
the answer, the answer is no. I mean, you're not going to get the 30%. That's why we're doing this analysis. And like I said, we can move the numbers, up and down, 5%, 10%, whatever you want to call it, but you're not going to get anywhere close to 30. So I feel pretty confident about that, given all the work that we've done around the region on this issue, including Cambridge and Boston. Just one data point, I think, in terms of the building heights, again, this is where I wish UTL was here because, they could rattle these off the top of their head, but the tallest structure here, the 6.5 stories, which is the highest one being tested in the VC3, that would be 84 feet. So I think they're using a 12-foot floor to floor for residential and obviously higher for commercial. But so you would, 84 is the highest. And then if you go to 5.5 stories, it would be 72 and then down to 60, so on and so forth. So that's kind of the range of what they were testing. And I think the half story, they were looking at pulling back the top floor on all of these. And obviously you can get more complex in how they're articulated, but that was just the sort of basic test that they were doing on the half floor.
Yeah, a little higher.
Yeah, it's a little higher than that, but
18, again, the code allows for a first floor maximum of 18 feet. that doesn't mean people will build 18 feet, 15 feet, floor to floor is probably more in line. And then, as John said, a 12-foot floor to floor max above that for the residential.
But what I was saying, so at VC2, which is a story lower, VC2, and I'm trying to find it in here, you do have some affordability, don't you? What's the affordability that comes out? with-
Our IZ is triggered at 8 or more units, so the base VC requires some level of affordability. But I think, as John was pointing, and others, these are significant increases in percentages that are not requiring any money from the city. I think, as another person said, it'd be interesting to see if a nonprofit developer came in, they might be coming with low-income housing tax credits. They might be coming with various other resources that allow them to go to deeper levels of affordability. This is a floor in our zoning that we believe we can set based on this economic analysis.
But you make VC2 work. And the thing is, this is gonna be a hard sell. And because of the heights. And so that's where I'm coming from. If you want to sell it, start at a lower height and then it can be the story, because you're saying.
One more factor in, and it's not necessarily the affordability, although it's a part of it. When I go around the city and I talk to, like going door to door for whatever purpose it might be for the override, it might be for my own campaign. I find that younger families say, I ask them, is there anything you want in Newton? And they say, bring me more younger families, because we are so few and far between. And one opportunity that this provides us is not just the affordability for people who, are 65% AMI, but for normal people that want to live in a place that can't afford $1.5 million for a modest house.
Sure.
So it allows them to come to Newton and live here as younger families. And we really do need that. We don't want to become a city of, we're heading towards 30% of older people, and we're going to go up from there, it seems to me.
Until there aren't anymore, and then we're gonna, just think of the direction we're pointing our community in demographically over time. That cohort of younger people is getting smaller. At what point are we completely changed?
Yeah. So that's just something else I wanted us to think about is besides the 65% AMI, bringing in families, normal families with kids who would love to live in Newton but can't afford it. This gives an opportunity for more of them to be here.
I'm gonna ask some questions about that, but I think Ryan wrote it.
I just had one recent real life example of this was the Santander Bank building, which actually met the footprint size was about 17,000 square feet for footprint.
Yes.
And the height size was 5 stories, and that's under MU4. And they were required to provide 17.5, which translated into 8 units. Under this scenario, they would have had to provide double that, 15 units, because they would have be up at 30% for essentially the same building.
But they would have been able to go higher by right.
Well, they're at 5
They're at
stories.
5 now, so it would 5.5, so another.
Isn't
half
it?
story.
That's a VC3 is right there. That's
That's correct.
proposed as a VC3.
Yes,
So did we let them off the hook too easy?
that's another question entirely. That's a special permit, but I'm just saying that's a good comparison.
Yeah.
I mean, they also built underground parking for all 50
They
units.
also restored a historic building.
Yeah, there was some other mitigating
Yes.
factors to play in there, but it is essentially that project under the village center zoning allowed by right, but would have a much higher percentage of affordable housing. And that was a project, by the way, that I think most people liked the design of and felt was appropriate for a village center.
Well, again, but the advantage that is a site-specific context, which, I mean, a lot of things going on in that site, not my ward, but I just follow that, I hope, at a distance. And part of the challenge we have is saying we're making a rule of general application throughout all of the BC districts, wherever they happen to be situated, which is a policy choice we're still sorting through. So I'm trying to figure out the, some of the issues that are also on the table of open space and pedestrian access and all of that. Certainly, more people means more people doing things in the area, but it also means they've got to get in and out and all of the things that go on with that degree of activity. So I guess I'm like to see the sort of totality a little more before I would say affordability, and not that these aren't affordable. We're asking them to be affordable in part anyway. The question is the increased percentage. It's not an absolute number that's very great. So it's not but the question is the change in the streetscape worth where, as a rule of general application, as opposed to a special permit where we can say this fits into this context well, and we know what we're getting for it and all of the trade-offs that you just described in that project. So that's part of the challenge that I think we're facing, which is to say, do we want to make this a generalized rule as opposed to something that has more site-specific specificity to it? And I don't think we have that choice as I read it now, unless we create a VC4 for this specific purpose that is something that you can cite and say, all right, this looks like a place where a tall building could work better, and therefore we want to get more affordability in return for it, and that's why we're doing it. That might make sense to me, because then you're in a position to justify it in a context. I'm just not confident I can justify it as a general matter.
No, we can zone it as a VC4. In this area, you can go up to it, but you know, in this example here, VC2 has the 30% affordability and 35% affordability, and he made it work. The height is going to be tough.
It is a tough sell. You're absolutely in our community, in some of our community anyway, but that's what we have to grapple with. And we also have to solve this puzzle. So, Mr. Lamel, and then I do have a hand up on the screen.
Right, and I think what we should back up that the premise where we started out, what, 2 years ago now, was village centers are the place to add more density. That's where we started this process. I know we've done a lot of work to get to VC1, VC2, VC3 at 4.5, 3.5, and 2.5 stories. And Councilor Baker couldn't put it any better. That's the question right here. Another thought is, what are the other things that we want to wrap up into this? And affordability, I think, is something that's been an undercurrent. And this is the proposal in front of you. And you might say, well, 1 story, 2 stories is too much. There's another piece here, Councilor Wright talked about varying the heights. Well, this is an opportunity now to get various heights between VC3, VC2. Not everyone is going to be able to go for this bonus or want to go for this bonus and go for the hassle of these additional affordability units.
Hugely risky.
So I think there's an incredible amount of opportunity here. We can think about it a little bit more, but I think Councilor Baker put it excellently. The question here is, is an additional story for 25% affordable units appropriate? Is an additional 2 stories for 30% affordability appropriate? And that's what's on the table before you now. And if we can get some clarity on that, then we can put that into the updated village center zone. And I think, Chuck, from the housing partnership, the reason why to generalize and make this by right is if you start to add in the special permit process, that time, that effort eats away at what you can do. Time is money, and that will chip away your affordability. It'll chip away at your design. It'll chip away at everything. And we can disagree on this, and I'm sure we do. But that's.
I think that's a reasonable point of view. I might not adopt it all the time, but I think it's a reasonable point of view. But the question, I guess, is how much of a fit is it? So, for instance, as opposed to saying, all right, would you accept 25% affordability and 6 stories through a special permit, but not as of right? In other words, you're going to say you're going to do better than baseline, and you're willing to go up, but then you have a context specific analysis. That to me is at least gives me a sense of more comfort in the context. Now, maybe that's not the general view, and you may want to say we don't want to go into special permits for just the reason you described. But but you might end up with a situation where you could say, all right, if you're going to do this for an additional story, we'd like to have a pretty clear sense of where those VC3 opportunities are. If you want to go up 2 stories, we're going to give you that only by special permit. You know, I don't know if that's an appropriate place to land, but it does seem to me that gives you context-specific resolution. Now, the other factors, I'm not quite sure about the sensitivity analysis. So for instance, if you're expanding the footprint, I don't know what that does to your effective open space, you know, that on the site. How much of that is a driver? Is the height the driver? Is that the big number?
By expanding the footprint, though, you'd still have other setback requirements.
I understand, but there's a bonus here, if I can put it that way,
Mhm.
and it's worth something. So I just don't know, is it worth a lot or little compared to the height, compared to the parking?
Sure.
So it seems to me that part of the value of this exercise is to say, there's some things you can do to provide additional development opportunity at some cost to the design space. And the question is, does that cost benefit work? And which is the most important of these elements? I don't know the answer to that. And maybe having another run by the department and thinking about this will give us some sense. Because you might come back and say, well, what really turns out to be key is the story, not the, you know, or there's some other aspect that will make this work better on the ground. I just don't know the answer to that. That's your territory. But I think it takes these scenarios and says, let's play with them a little bit to understand what's the sensitive element and what's not, and how much it matters.
I can, yeah, and we can do that analysis. I think, you know, right off the bat, though, parking reduction and not having to build structured parking is by far the most beneficial. So just throw that out there, right? That's going to be number one. And that's something we have to come back to in the committee still as well, which helps any project, never mind just from a financial and economics point of view.
And open space.
And open space point of view. Councilor Lucas, you've had your hand up for a while. Sorry, I wanted to bring this conversation to some kind of an end. Please go ahead.
No, that's perfectly all right. I enjoyed this conversation this evening, talking about important things, talking about the, I guess you could say, the financials in the VC2, VC3 for option 1, option 2. It's a good conversation to have. I just have a couple of quick questions. Director Heath, you were mentioning something about the Santander Bank. I didn't follow it. You were saying that that was MU4 and it's 8 inclusionary units. And you said if it was VC3, it would have been 15. Did I hear that right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I had it at 30%, not 25, I realized. So I was using the 30% figure to get double the units.
Oh, sorry, go on.
As opposed to 17.5%.
If we adopted option 2.
Option
No?
1.
Oh,
Option 1 is 25%.
Yeah. Oh, I thought you said you just calculated it at 30%. We didn't.
I did it at 30%. It should have been 25%. I was going with option 1.
Which is option 2.
okay. I just wanted to make sure that we were talking about the same thing. So that was the project would have been bigger under your case, Director Heath, right?
It would have been a half story bigger, correct?
It would have been a half story bigger and we would have gotten a few more inclusionary units, right?
Correct.
Okay, all right. Just want to make sure I heard that correct. Thank you. And I think I heard, I don't know who said it earlier. It was prior to that conversation. I was talking about you've never seen 30% affordable or anything close to that, around 4 to 5 stories. I think someone mentioned that. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but just want to point it out that the Riverdale development in Nonantum off of California Street, that's a 40B, is 25% affordable, and I believe that's 5 stories. So it's not quite at 30%, but it's getting there. Just want to.
The important distinction there is that the affordability level is at 80% of area median income. So it's quite a higher affordability level. We're talking about 65% here.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Just want to. Yep, that's correct. And just in general, big picture talk now. We're talking a lot about the financials for the proposals for VC3, VC2. with the base condition in option 1, option 2. I know that's a mouthful. In the VC zoning for the person or the persons, the petitioner who's going to build the projects, but talking about their bottom line. But I'm also concerned that we're not having another conversation about the financials, and that's quite frankly, the bottom line, the cost and revenues to the city. Is there going to be a robust financial plan or financial analysis for the city's taxpayers?
I think we could talk about this offline but these types of projects are very typically net positive given the value creation and the taxes drawn from them. Density is sustainable economically, but we can talk more about the details offline.
I would prefer to have the conversation online. These are financials. These are the costs to the city, the revenues to the city. Why can't we have the plans as we have right here for the that was in our packet? Why can't we have that conversation in a ZAP committee meeting?
So what we can do is we can look at some recent examples. I'll go back to the Santander building. I think it may have been you that requested the financial analysis on that. And we provided that. It was a pretty positive, net positive there.
No.
Tax, I'm sorry?
You provided the revenue
Correct.
to the, but not the costs. That I'm asking for both the revenue and the costs for these projects. If this is all going to be by right, meaning no special permit, I want to make sure we get this right now before we vote on it.
So in the Santander example, we didn't provide the cost because there's no financial analysis required there. What we gave you was the increase in the overall assessment.
Right. That is correct. You did provide that, and I did ask for that. But for this, I'm asking if you could provide the costs. Again, I'm not asking it has to be 100% accurate, but if you could provide the costs and the revenues, so we can at least see what are the benefits to VC2, VC3, to the taxpayer.
Yeah, I think
we have a right to know.
We'd have to look at a completed project to see what the costs are. And I'm not sure how easy that will be, but we can certainly look at that.
Maybe John, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I didn't want to weigh in sort of out of turn here, but I mean, we do that kind of work in certain places, including Newton. And I think, I would back up Zach's general statement that most of the time when you're talking about residentially driven 4 to 5 to 6 story development, that it is fiscally positive for the city, including the revenues and the costs, including school children. The main question would be an analysis like this is what are you replacing, right? We'd have to make some assumption. I don't know, it's obviously going to be different across every site. If you're replacing really high value commercial space, that net benefit might shrink a bit. But I think given the additional density and what I know about the budget in Newton and the cost and revenues, I think it's generally a good assumption to say that it would be positive, but you could certainly test a couple case studies and say, under what scenario would it not be positive if you were replacing, some very, very valuable commercial building, which is probably not going to happen, but it's worth, I think, asking the question. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you. That would be helpful if we could have that conversation in a ZAP committee meeting. Let's put it out on the table. I prefer not to have that conversation offline. I want it online. But again, my 2 cents.
Sure, and I think just to maybe close this loop, maybe for a Friday packet in the future, we could provide some academic research or research in the planning field that generalize again that this type of development are net positives for the city.
And I think, Zach, you have fiscal impact analyses, around town. Is it exactly this project? No. Is it, forecasts? Yes. But I think you have examples in your own city that you could at least point to as a starter to the conversation. If you want to test it on some specific sites here, you can do that as well. But that would be a good place to start.
Yeah, a couple of questions. Are you all set, Councilor Lucas?
Yep, thank you.
So President Albright and then Councilor Ryan.
So two things. One is the Santander Bank. I'm thinking that they preserved a historic building. Is there any credit for that? I mean, we've talked around that about, we said, oh, we'll get to it later. But I mean, in that particular instance, they did preserve a historic building, and it has no value, but it does have value. So I don't know how that gets factored into the equation.
I mean, are you saying for this, if someone were to preserve an existing building and they wanted to take advantage of some sort of a bonus but they'd have to meet these affordability percentages, but the preservation is costly and
Yes, exactly.
That'd be something we could look into. It might make sense that if we want to incentivize the preservation of the building through conversion, maybe the affordability percentages don't work for that. I mean, that's where you're talking about competing desires here.
Exactly. Because I think there were some issues. You couldn't do parking under the building because you couldn't go under the building. So I think it's worth taking into account what that can happen again.
I think that's true, but I do think if you look at where we've mapped VC3 and VC2, the general sites, I think this makes sense, right? The thinking about new construction. I think we should clarify and look into that when it comes to preservation.
I thought that was a separate line item and we wanted to go through reuse what buildings and,
Sure.
who would get that bonus or whatever. That was a discussion we had, I think, in the last month.
Yep.
So one other thing, and that was I'm wondering if it would make, I don't even know if this is a possible suggestion, but are there areas in the village centers where height is more favorable than other parts of the village? So are there some VC3s where you say, yeah, this is the place where we could do the 2-story bonus, and this is the part of VC3 where you couldn't do the bonus? And I don't know how you designate that, but would that make you feel better about it?
Well, that's part of the special permit question, I thought, if you went up to 2 stories.
No, but you can decide in advance these areas.
If you I think that's part of the issue that we're wrestling with, which
Yeah.
is, there are some places where the site-specific outcome might be just fine, but you've got to try and do this as of right and map it all over town. So that's why there's a question, we're trying to limit the number of zones, but if you made a VC4 and then you said that's the portion of the VC3 that's appropriate for greater height, I mean, that's what you're asking.
That's what I'm asking.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that.
No,
I think
think about that.
the other, I have another question though, that if I can.
But I do have Councilor Ryan
No,
first,
please.
and then yes, and then you'll be next.
No, no, no,
Councilor Ryan.
This I'm sitting here trying to figure out answers to my own questions, and then you just came up with maybe an answer to it. I wrestle with the height a lot too, and what you said about, well, maybe it should be a VC4, maybe a VC3 plus, where and what Council Baker says, where we map it out beforehand. Because what I worry about is, I don't want to see 7 stories in a place where it's not going to be appropriate. But I do want the affordable housing. What I worry about with the special permit, and I would, if we could map it out instead of going to a special permit, which I think at certain height I'd have to be in favor of. But my problem with the special permit is, are we just talking about height, or is it going to get all bogged down with everything that usually happens with special permits? And we're looking at village center space becoming a 4-year battle. And that just defeats everything. So that's what I worry about. And I know, I guess you cannot just say, okay, we're gonna go to land use and do a special permit just for the height, but I don't think you can do that.
So just to tag on to this a little bit and put another puzzle piece that might not fit on the table. Aren't we doing something like that we're going to talk about on Wednesday with respect to identifying key streets where we want to have retail? And we haven't had that conversation fully yet, and I'm not sure what the sentiment's going to be toward working that one way or another. You suggest in your memo, for example, that we can count the units toward MBTA communities if we do it one way. That's how I read it, but not the way we have it. So, but it's a way of identifying locations where we want to do something in particular that we think is going to be best for that area. We want active streetscapes there. How do we get them? Do we require it? Do we incentivize it? Do we map it somehow? As I'm saying this, it's seeming really complex because our community is complex, because our community, our villages are also different, and the lots are so different, and the adjacencies are so different. On the one hand, we're trying to move toward something where we have, the higher density going to the lower density, and we're basically constructing a long-term future. But on the other hand, there's what exists now. And, putting a 6.5-story building on Lincoln Street in the proposed VC3 next to the Stevens building seems really wrong. Okay, I mean, that would just be too out of context. So it's sort of a question and put it on the table. So I had Councilor Baker.
So you've had a lot of things to chew on, obviously, and I assume you'll come back after you've thought about all this and solved all these questions. But the one piece of the puzzle that we really haven't talked about that I think is important to at least give you a reaction, and that's whether you want to do the same thing with VC2. I'm uneasy about the VC2 bonuses for precisely the reason that they are going to be right down there. They're the transition zone to the VC1s, which are right next to the residential. So if there's a case for height, I think it's going to be most successfully made in the VC3, because they're an area that you've identified already is going to be sort of the most dense and most intense. I'm not sure I'm ready to go for the density bonus or the development opportunity bonus. I don't want to call it density because it's not that, it's still a different framework, but I'm more receptive to the idea of gaining affordability in the VC3 for some of the reasons that Councilor it's a long day, guys. I'm sorry. As articulated. The problem is in the city, people get older and the memories aren't as good as they used to.
Yeah, no, and I think we could look at that. I totally get what folks are saying. Although I would say that there are some probably VC2 examples that may be appropriate for additional height as well.
Yeah.
Because not all VC2s are.
But that again, what we keep backing into is that there is what the map looks like and how it's drawn and what the districts are, again, is a part of the tuning actually.
So, Councilor, what I'm hearing is the taller buildings, say 4.5, 5.5, 6.5 stories. That people may be comfortable with them in certain parts of the village centers. Now, we're here the art of compromise here, right? So I want to see something get done. I'd like to see village center zoning pass. So what about having a VC3 A and B areas where we would identify areas that would be appropriate for taller buildings, like parts of West Newton, you know, are there, that near that, parts of Newtonville maybe? And then I mean, I agree, there are areas where I don't want to see a 5.5 or 6.5 story building. Although I do like the Masonic building in Newtonville. And so, good, again, a case of good design, can always be made, but I think that many of my colleagues would feel much more comfortable having some certainty about where the greater height would go, rather than just all BC3. So that's what I'm hearing.
I just think if anybody, counselor on the call or here in the room would, wants to go through the maps and say, not in this VC3, yes, in this VC3, you have our emails. We'd love to see those.
Identify our own.
We'd love to get that feedback.
Areas where we think that would work, right?
Because again, we're really talking about a very small portion of the city.
Yeah.
I would actually like to see VC3 be replaced with VC2 with the different heights. And then in a few places where VC3 could go, like in the north side of Langley Street. Just that's what I'd like to see. And I will bring that. My next question is, and because if we require retail on the first floor, none of this is going to count towards our MBTA Act, which, we're talking about 7 stories, possibly 7 stories, and not the housing's not counting at all. And we're only at 40% of our requirement. My question is, and you have spoke that you have been reaching out to DHCD, and I would think Brookline's also asking about the mixed use and things like that. Can you share with us, your correspondence and what's coming back with you when you're reaching out to them about some
We're
changes?
gonna talk about that on Wednesday.
I want to add to what
Okay, go ahead.
Emily Norton, Councilor Norton called me this afternoon to say that she went to the swearing in of the new MBTA people. And she said, I couldn't help myself. I went up to Lieutenant Governor Driscoll and I said, she asked, how are you doing with the MBTA Communities Act? And Councilor Norton said, you're making it hard for us because you don't allow mixed use. And she said, what? We don't allow mixed use? We have to fix that. So I wanted to put that on she said she's willing to follow it up with a letter to Commissioner Driscoll, Lieutenant Governor Driscoll, if you guys would be willing to help her write it. But for whatever that's worth, that I just wanted you to know that.
Because that would be huge.
Yeah.
She said, we love mixed use. Why aren't we allowing mixed
Well,
use?
the statute doesn't say that.
I know.
It doesn't say that. It also doesn't say you have to have 50% of the districts contiguous. Doesn't say that.
Yeah, I mean,
Statute
there's
doesn't
some,
say that.
it gets to anticipate something on Wednesday. I just think that the guidelines in the act are not exactly in alignment.
Yeah.
And I think we're bound by the act, but I'm not sure we're bound by all of them.
Well, we already know we weren't. We got our inclusionary zoning ordinance.
I think that's so the point is that they're not of equal force, that's all.
I think the lieutenant governor will be very interested in more detail.
So I think we should provide that.
Yeah, I think so too.
I was in Brookline talking to my accountant in Coolidge One, she lives a block away. And it was the same conversation that you said, and they dropped, she told me today that they were dropping off the signs, the lawn signs. I didn't quite understand what you were saying they said, but it's the same argument. If there's enough cities and towns that are saying, wait a minute, we can't do this without the mixed use. And she was specifically talking about Harvard Street, that we've always had mixed use on Harvard Street. We'll put the apartments on top, and we gotta have and she's right,
What was the reasoning to not allowing mixed use?
Oh, it's somebody didn't know what they were doing.
I'm shocked.
I dealt with the state for 24 years. You want to talk about people. They don't ask the right people. That's what it is. They don't ask us.
Right, they've been willing to listen and make changes.
Yeah.
So that I have.
Yeah, and now we have a new administration, and the lieutenant governor is a planner and a very successful mayor.
Yeah.
as well.
And are they switching or providing the two, that you just, their economic and housing, and they're making a
Yes.
different decisions?
Yeah.
too?
Yeah, I think we can get this. In town.
I'm glad we saw that.
In the meantime, Madam Chair, do we move home?
Is that a motion to hold?
Yes,
Councilor
that's fine.
Baker?
Go ahead.
I think that's a delicious idea.
Good question.
Oh, okay.
So I don't know
Councilor
how,
Baker.
how long, and this is more the MBTA, but how long it takes for the calculations, but can you do the calculations on Wednesday? I don't know if it's just a quick thing to allow all the mixed use to count, so we can see what our number would be.
So the numbers that we ran. Should I save this for Wednesday, or do you want me to answer this now?
I actually think we should mostly save it for Wednesday, but you could talk about what your intention is for when the
I
Wednesday.
can say this specifically, the numbers that you see show the VC3 at 2.5 stories.
No.
Not 4.5 stories, so it's not, they're not removed.
Okay, well, the thing is, we've talked about requiring first floor
Correct.
retail, and are those included in those
No,
calculations?
those are not in those calculations.
So the question is for Wednesday, I don't know how difficult it is to run this. Can you rerun this with mixed use at, 5 stories? All in VC3.
What you're asking is the areas where we've marked as requiring mixed use to remove them from the proposal.
From just the calculation, and the other parts of VC3 to allow it to be 4.5 stories.
So I think on Wednesday, we've got the memo, so we see what the variables can be. And you are going to be speaking to those variables on Wednesday.
Yes.
What you're asking is, will we know by then
I don't
how
believe
much,
so.
how many more units are?
We might be able to have discussions of order of magnitude, what does it get us
Roughly another
approximately?
2,000
Yeah,
units,
exactly,
something like
those
that.
kinds of things, yes, we can have that conversation.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't know how difficult it is to run this simulation.
Well, and just one more thing, while I agree philosophically, I don't think you're gonna have any argument from the planning department, that's the best outcome, is to have mixed use be able to count under MBTA
Sure.
communities, because that's what we want. We also have a deadline ahead of us that we need to be cognizant of, and while I would like to be hopeful as well, it is what it is at this point in time, so
Well, would you help Councilor Norton write the letter?
we could do that.
Okay.
I'm in too.
I'm
I
in.
mean, yeah.
Yes.
I had a conversation with her at another event and she said, and I said, I'd love to have your cell. And she said, oh, I think you have it. We had a conversation when I was running. And I looked back and it was just the campaign phone number, So, it's hard to get the attention of a new administration, so relatively early in the term, but I think we have to.
So I'm happy to move it.
We have a motion to hold on the table. Is there any discussion on the motion? Good one. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Yeah, thank you. I don't want to pronounce your name incorrectly. Tementosi?
Yep, Trementosi, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for your work and the work of the Newton Housing Partnership and staff. I think that this was a really excellent, in my opinion, dive into this idea of, what's economically feasible so that we could achieve more affordable housing. You can see we're not near a decision yet. But thank you. It was a very, very helpful analysis. So with that,
Then I'm gonna ask for a brief recess, so we come back.
Because we got parking yet.
You got that, right?
we can talk about if we want to, we could hold on a second. If we want to stay here for another half an hour, we can talk about anything we want.
So I'm not sure about the rest.
Yeah, lots of questions.
Okay, So we're not ending the meeting. So we shouldn't have moved hold on the item. Yeah, well, it's one item. Yeah. So we're gonna, so folks, committee members in particular, we need Mr. Cranston, Counselor Cranston, are you still there?
I'm here. Do you want to do the two appointment or reappointments? While Counselor Baker takes his break?
Yes, how about that? Let me get my.
We will have to vote reconsideration if we think.
We have to move reconsideration on the motion to hold. All those in favor of reconsideration, please say aye.
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 Opposed, and then, okay, we're reconsidered, we're gonna keep that item open. And I'm gonna get my proper glasses on. We have two reappointments to take care of. Item 95-23 is the reappointment by Her Honor the Mayor of William Winkler, sorry, to the Urban Design Commission, term to expire on June 1st, 2026. Do we have a motion?
I'm happy to move approval on that one.
Thank you. We have a motion to approve. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Opposed or abstaining? Okay, that's unanimous. And 96-23 is the reappointment of James Doolin by Her Honor the Mayor to the Urban Design Commission for a term of office to expire March 1, 2026. Do I have a motion?
I like the motion to approve.
Thank you. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed or abstentions? And that is also unanimous. So we have item 38-22 back before us for a general conversation on the proposed zoning, but I think folks want to talk more about parking. There's some questions that
I have questions on it.
Set the stage here. So I think this was particularly for Councilor Albright. You had asked to come up with some examples of
And thank you,
communities. Our new member, Joe O'Donoghue, Planning Associate, that helped write this one and do the research, which I think is incredibly helpful. But it was just to provide more background on communities that have eliminated parking minimums or incorporated parking maximums and some of the impacts. I think as we pulled a few examples, but this is very much becoming the norm to remove parking minimums either citywide, in downtown specific areas, main streets, etc. And I think what you're seeing from these communities is investment and a reinvestment, right? You're seeing new development, you're seeing businesses expanding that couldn't expand before due to some of these requirements. And just in general, a net positive when it comes to removing essentially paper rules and allowing the market either to guide in some cases, and then in other cases, again, establishing a maximum to set the framework for not only what we want to see on an individual lot, but what you want to see in these areas more generally. So I can leave it at that.
Thank you for that. So. Councilor Wright.
So I was reading through this, the case studies and that. So in Hartford, Connecticut, it says, talk about they eliminated parking minimums and they established parking maximums, and they had a winter parking ban when snow fell is expected. So that sounds like it wasn't a winter parking ban, but a snow emergency.
That is what it sounds like.
Okay. And what is their parking maximum? And is this citywide?
Believe it is citywide for Hartford, but we can take a specific look at their ordinance.
And how much is it? You know, what's the number?
I don't have it off the top of my head.
Then. So then in Fayetteville, Arkansas, they eliminated downtown parking minimums. To get just a rough idea, how much is actually commercial versus residential? Do they have a lot of residential in that area? Is it 50-50, 80-20, something like that? Because that does make a little bit of a difference. And how much parking was available, like if it's mostly commercial, and there's already a lot of lots, you know, that does make a difference. Like in Newton, the villages are not equal. You know, Newton Center has a lot more commercial parking, you know, public parking than Woburn and Newton, West Newton. So it does affect it. Then the question is with Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, and Brookline, you stated the eliminated parking minimums. Is that citywide or downtown only?
I think some of those are through the special permit process, or that you can ask for reductions. I think in Somerville, as part of their overhaul, they have either reduced or and instituted maximums, and I think they have TOD areas of the city where it's specifically called out, where there aren't parking requirements.
Okay, so it's not citywide, but specific areas. And then I was looking at the data and attachments, and I was kind of disappointed on the attachment A when it was talking about the data to support the final perfect fit report. And that was only for projects in Newton, the two Avalons, Village Falls Condo, and Woodland. And I think you guys gave us more units and data than what's actually there provided by the state.
I think those MAPC studies, there's been numerous iterations of them. There's been at least 4 versions where they've looked.
Okay, this is the one that you linked in your appendix.
That's the one that's been finally complete. I'm not sure the one that was done this past fall has been completed. So
Right.
we've been using numbers from that because we have them.
Okay, so what you've been providing is the latest one, and this one is an earlier version.
That's correct.
Okay, I was a little confused on that one. In the state, they have the Smart Growth, Smart Energy Toolkit. This is by law, the Smart Parking Model bylaw. And it talks about parking minimums, but we're looking at it, ignoring that, even though that's part of their toolkit.
Could you say what that is?
So it says the following bylaw provisions for a smart parking model bylaw. And it's part of the state of Massachusetts for implementing smart parking strategies. 3 issues. 1, reducing the standards for required parking. So it doesn't say eliminating it. 2, solutions for shared and off-site parking. And 3, parking area design. And then reducing parking, there's 2 strategies: maximum parking requirements and the minimum parking requirements, which are typically 20 to 80% of the maximum, depending on the associated use. And I don't know if this is outdated or not, but they're saying that there should be a minimum, and I just wanted to understand the difference of all those.
I think you're pointing to one resource. I think when you go across the board, the idea of either elimination or minimums or incorporating maximum, those kind of where people are going. And I know the latest MAPC report that will be coming out, I believe, one of their findings is elimination of requirements and introducing maximums.
I see that the new member of the planning department, who I would love to meet, by the way, is showing himself and with his hand up. So could we get introduced?
Hey everybody, I'm Joe. I'm the new planning associate. So I help the department out on some of the parking analysis here. And I can't get to all of the questions in there, but I know that Hartford was entirely citywide. Cambridge is entirely citywide, getting rid of their minimums. Boston is for affordable housing. And Somerville is like a complicated combination of affordable housing and other factors. If I remember correctly on that. And as far as that parking bylaw, that comes from 2007. So that was already at least a recommendation for lowering minimums then. And as time has gone on and progressed, there's been more evidence as more cities have done this, with Buffalo being like the first major city to do that in 2015. But that would have been pretty ahead of the evidence at the time. As far as how downtown Fayetteville is, that's mostly a commercial zone. So there was a lot of vacant lots in that area. And that is something that's worth considering is, you want these minimums to be changed where you think that there's a glut of parking or would be with the type of development that's going in. And I don't think it would be in line with any of our department's recommendations to get rid of parking entirely in, entirely residential areas. And Barney, Zach, anything else I missed on that? Okay.
And then I just had one more thing on those maps, which is the attachment B in Hartford and stuff. And the black map that shows below a map of downtown Hartford with surface parking lots shown in black, well, it isn't. Well, if you look at the map on the right, there's a lot of under building parking, and now it's been changed, or parking and structures are now changed to surface parking. So I don't think this black map is correct, because I think it includes all the parking and not just the surface parking lots down below, because there's 12 places, roughly 12 places I counted that were structure parking, now saying it's surface parking. And then there's one that says where it was underneath the building, and now you're saying it's surface parking. So you need to, I think, change that. And it would have been helpful to have the same map, because this third map kind of goes beyond what is shown on the second map. So it would have been easier to compare apples to apples.
Yeah, that was from a separate source than those first two images. So there were some different looks at it. It was mostly just that surface parking, and it didn't take into account any of the underground or anything there, but you definitely see some lots disappearing. But if we need to do more analysis on Hartford, then I can take a look at the individual lots later.
And I understand, yes, a lot of the lots disappeared, which is good, but it's from the previous maps, some were underground parkings and some were structure, and now they're saying it's surface lot, which I don't think is true. So that bottom map might be all the parking that's left, the combination of the third one and the other one's removed. It would, again, I'm into the details, and it was just a little bit of confusing that things were changing and it didn't make sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Baker.
I just have a question. I remember that Hartford, if I recall, was suffering for a while from underdevelopment. There was concern, but I was curious what happened to Western. I mean, that's a center city versus a more suburban landowner, and I don't know if there's any information about that. Okay, as part of the challenge we're trying to do is to say, what can we learn from, but is it an apt analogy in that way? I just don't know.
I think a good takeaway is, regardless of the city size, I think you're typically seeing positive investment and results when parking requirements are reduced or eliminated. For example, it could help with a small vacant lot that would essentially have to be all parking if it wanted to construct something. Or it could be an existing business that's, succeeding and maybe wants to expand, but that expansion on paper in zoning requires them to provide 20 more parking spaces that they don't have, and therefore they don't expand. So those are the benefits that you're typically seeing across the board, whether it's a city size of 5,000 or 500,000.
So let me, my question's not as good as I'd like it to be, so let me try it one more time. I think that the question is, there are situations clearly where if you reduce the parking requirement, it makes it less expensive to develop. I think that, even I can pick that up. The question I'm trying to figure out is, what are the externalities that come from that we're not absorbing? And if there were no parking demand that is going to be unmet, and therefore going to be a problem of spillover impacts or traffic that we can't absorb, we don't have a really good system to deal with short-term drop-offs and pickups. All of those things seem to me part of the mix. But clearly you can do more development if you don't have the parking requirement. The question is that a wise judgment? And it may be that the numbers and the requirements we have are not sophisticated, and they should be. And I'm open to persuasion that what should be. I'm just not yet ready to make a categorical judgment.
Sure, no.
So that's all.
As the recommenders to the city council, we can simply say, yes, it is worth it, and you can take that as you will.
No, but I'd like to do it on an informed basis.
Sure, no, of course.
Councilor Larry?
So, one thing to keep in mind is that if we're not, requiring a certain amount of parking, is that doesn't mean the parking won't get built, because the developers kind of, I think, have a better sense usually than our kind of blanket, just, parking requirements, which kind of make a whole lot of sense. And then giving them barriers to economic development. And so keep that in mind, is that that doesn't mean that parking won't be provided. It just means that we're not, I don't think the city council is necessarily the best decision maker on how much parking is needed for different uses, different areas. And I think it's clear that we have a lot of overparked buildings. It would be interesting to see, maybe get some more data about what kind of parking is getting provided in cities and towns that have eliminated parking minimums. And in what cases are they doing maximums? And there's a big difference between residential and commercial too, so.
Yes.
I seem to be falling in love with parking maximums. Because then the city council gets out of the business of deciding what's a minimum, what businesses should have, and we have to figure out what the right maximum number is. But then lets the market bring what the market needs.
That reminds me of the Monty Python movie where they actually wear your favorite color is, and he said red, no blue, and then he gets blown off the bridge.
I said, reminding you of that.
Yeah. I'm not sure I'm gonna do the same.
That's the funniest movie, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to think about that on the line tonight.
Best line is run away. That's what we gotta do.
Points. Oh, so go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. So, I mean, I think our parking requirements are too much, and I think they should be reduced. I'm not convinced yet to eliminate parking minimum, but I come back to each village is not created equal. And I have an issue with, if a wildly popular 250 seat restaurant opens up in Woburn, and if people really want to go, they're going to find the parking, but that might push other businesses with less parking. And in West Newton, one of the reasons why it went out of business is because of the parking. There's another business leaving to Watertown because they don't have enough parking for clients. So I think there should be some balance. I don't think we can just do a blanket across the city. All the villages are the same, because Newton Center has a lot more public parking available.
So it's late in the evening, but
I just want to,
the example you gave, I think, wouldn't work for another reason to requires a special permit for anything over 50 seats, as I recall.
well, what I would just say in that is that the market will know that, right? The market will not build a 250 seat restaurant in Woburn
Because
if they don't have the parking that they think it needs to succeed. The zoning doesn't need to tell you that.
There's
that.
egos in the restaurant business.
So I'm going to call on Councilor Krinsman first, as member of the committee, and then I'll go back to Councilor Lucas.
Thank you, Madam. Oh, I didn't realize my video's off. Sorry. I've been sitting here looking so wonderful the whole time. I don't think we've talked about parking a few times, fortunately. And I don't think I've heard, with the exception of Councilor Albright, President Albright, and kudos to you, I don't think I've heard any movement from anyone in their position. So I'd love it if we could sort of take a straw vote and maybe move on and discuss other things.
A straw vote on whether we should reduce from 1, on whether we should eliminate requirements for parking for ground floor retail, on, I mean, give me the things. I mean, we can take a straw vote.
I would rather think our frame something at a time when we can think through it and have a vote that matters. I'm not confident that 10 of 10 is going to make the best outcome for this conversation, but that's up to you now.
I mean, we could vote on whether we like donuts or bagels.
We could vote on whether 4 shall be the number and the number shall be 4. But my preference would be to eliminate all parking minimums. If President Albright wants to introduce parking maximums, understandable. I would eliminate all parking minimums across the board in the village center zoning. The whole point of this is that we're trying to get some additional density and some additional housing in these places where there's proximity to public transportation and stores and the necessities of people's lives. I just don't think we should be mandating any parking in the village centers.
I'm associating myself with Councilor Krinsman's
And
comments.
I am extremely sympathetic. I just also want this package of new zoning to pass. So Director Heath?
Just to throw one more thing into the mix, there's a huge additional MBTA communities benefit by reducing parking.
By eliminating.
Yeah, because
By
you have
eliminating
to account for the space for a car in their formula. So we'll learn more about that on Wednesday.
So maybe we should wait and take the straw vote on after Wednesday.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, let me just be clear. I don't think we need to vote right now at 9:50 when folks are tired. I just don't think we need to waste hours more discussing it when, like I said, people haven't moved. You know, I'm happy to put any straw vote on the table at any time. I just think we're going around in circles.
All right, thank you.
A quick question to Mr. Heath. So the MBTA loan doesn't, it sounds like they take into account surface parking. They don't take into account that it could be all underground parking in the formula?
The formula, it's available online, so you can take a look at it, but yes, it assumes surface parking, period.
That's wrong.
I mean, that's
Another thing when you write to the,
Well,
because our projects are doing that.
Focus
So
on there are a
Santander
few
has
points that are
been-
more effective.
The project that got approved and all the residential parking is underground.
Which makes the project very much more expensive also. But obviously, we're unlike other further out communities that have more land. And so
Correct.
I would imagine that's where the thinking came from.
correct. Well, we can talk about it more on Wednesday.
Okay, let's not veer off topic here. And we do have Councilor Lucas who would like to say a few words. No.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just real quick, are we talking about parking, residential parking or commercial parking?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Wait, which one?
Oh, now do I jump
Oh,
up?
which one is it?
It's both.
It's both.
Oh, it's both. Okay. All right. Thank you. So you would be taking a vote on Wednesday on potentially eliminating parking minimums or introducing a excuse me, a parking maximum in the VC zoning
I don't know.
for residential and commercial.
I don't know that we're gonna be voting on anything on Wednesday, but the suggestion was that we should wait and see, learn more about how these formulas are working or not working, or just how they're working, and take that into account.
Okay, and I think Councilor Krinsman is correct. I don't think anyone's gonna move a great deal, so I gotta give him props on that one.
I might.
I changed a lot. I went way away from where I started.
Okay, so now, Councilor Baker, would you like to redeem yourself by? We did that while you went to get, yes. So,
Hold.
yes, please. Yes,
You're
please.
sure? Are you sure about this?
I'm sure about it, but I don't know.
Okay. First
It
time.
might be easier just to move reconsideration of the motion to consider, and then we could undo the undoing and just be back where we started.
Go to sleep.
Sorry.
Yes. Okay, thank you, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. I wonder if Councilor Danberg is actually listening. I think it's probably 4 in the morning where she is. I hope she can turn off her machine for the rest of the night.
It'll run out of battery.
But thank you, everybody. Thanks for all the good work. The memos were very clear. And more Wednesday. See you at 6:30 on Wednesday.
Did we actually hold the item though?
Council President? Oh, hold on. Council President, yes?
Did we hold the item?
Yes, we did.
Okay, cool.
And I hope everyone can come in on Wednesday. I know they.
No, I'm gonna be in Wisconsin.
Oh, never mind.
Where are you gonna be? Wisconsin.
Oh, my God, you're gonna